It began before the sun rose across a front so vast it felt unreal, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where millions of men stood waiting for an order that would change the course of history forever. In the early summer of 1941, the world's largest invasion force assembled in silence. Engines were warmed quietly. Maps were unfolded and refolded until their edges softened. Soldiers were told this campaign would be short, decisive, almost inevitable. The Soviet Union, they were assured, would collapse under the weight of speed, surprise, and force. This was Operation Barbarossa, not just an invasion, but a gamble built on certainty. The plan was breathtaking in scale. 3 massive army groups would surge eastward at once. Armored spearheads would encircle entire Soviet armies. Cities would fall before they could organize resistance. The war would be won before winter ever mattered. It was not designed as a conventional campaign. It was designed as annihilation of armies, of ideology, of an entire way of life. From the very beginning, Barbarossa was more than a military operation. It was a war of destruction. When the attack began, it felt unstoppable. The Red Army was caught off balance. Airfields burned on the ground. Fronts collapsed faster than reports could travel. German columns advanced at a pace that stunned even their own commanders. Towns fell in days, roads filled with prisoners, maps filled with arrows pushing deeper and deeper east. To those watching from Berlin, it looked like confirmation that history itself was on their side. But beneath that momentum, cracks were already forming. Distances stretched farther than expected. Supply lines thinned. Vehicles wore down. Men exhausted themselves under summer heat and endless dust. And the enemy did not disappear. Soviet forces retreated, but they also returned. Counterattacks erupted where none were expected. Encircled units continued fighting. New formations appeared from the interior. Losses were catastrophic, yet resistance hardened instead of fading. The land itself became an enemy. Roads dissolved into mud after summer storms. Rivers slowed movement. Forests swallowed units whole. As weeks turned into months, the invasion lost its clean rhythm. Battles like Smolensk dragged on. Kiev brought massive encirclement and massive delay. Every pause pushed the campaign closer to autumn. And autumn, in the east, meant something far worse was waiting. Meanwhile, the human cost escalated beyond comprehension. Civilians were targeted deliberately. Entire villages vanished. Mass executions followed the advance. Operation Barbarossa unleashed violence on a scale that stripped away any remaining illusion of a conventional war. Hunger, terror, and brutality followed the front line like shadows. This was not collateral damage. It was policy. By the time German forces approached Moscow, the invasion was already breaking under its own weight. Winter arrived early and without mercy. Fuel froze. Weapons jammed. Men wrapped themselves in anything they could find. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, launched counteroffensives that pushed exhausted invaders back from the capital. The moment of decision had passed. What was meant to be a short campaign had become a war of survival. Operation Barbarossa failed not in a single moment, but gradually. It failed because speed could not defeat distance, because ideology could not replace logistics, because brutality created resistance instead of submission. It marked the beginning of a struggle that would consume entire nations, reshape borders, and leave scars that remain visible decades later. Barbarossa matters because it explains everything that followed. Stalingrad, Kursk, the march to Berlin. All of it traces back to this moment when ambition outran reality, and the largest invasion in history ignited a war that could no longer be controlled. Tonight, we return to that dawn, to the engines starting in the dark, to the moment when certainty felt absolute and proved fatal, to Operation Barbarossa, where the Second World War entered its most devastating chapter. And before we go any further, if you're still here, listening carefully, if these long, unhurried journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or make sense of a world that often feels overwhelming, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time with care, patience, and respect for the people who lived these events. Subscribing doesn't just support the work. It keeps this kind of thoughtful, immersive storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, calm, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the complete history of Operation Barbarossa. Moscow, August 23rd, 1939. The crystal chandeliers of the Kremlin's Catherine Hall cast their light on two men who despised everything the other represented. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, stood beside Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's cold-eyed diplomat, as champagne glasses clinked in a toast that fooled no one. The photographers captured smiles. The signatures on the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact were still wet. But in the corner of that ornate room, both German and Soviet officials understood they were watching theater, not diplomacy. This pact wasn't peace. It was an intermission before the real war began. The agreement stunned the world. Fascism and communism, ideologies that had spent a decade declaring each other the ultimate evil, now proclaimed friendship. Secret protocols, hidden from public view, carved Eastern Europe like a butcher dividing meat. Germany would take Western Poland. The Soviet Union would take Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and have a free hand in Finland. For Hitler, it meant he could invade Poland without fighting the Soviets. For Stalin, it meant time, a buffer zone, and resources. Both leaders signed, knowing full well that this arrangement was temporary. The question wasn't if they would fight. The question was when and who would strike first. The pact gave Hitler what he needed to start World War II. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. Britain and France declared war. But the Soviets didn't oppose Germany. They joined the feast. On September 17th, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east. Polish forces, already reeling from the German onslaught, now faced enemies on two fronts. By October, Poland had ceased to exist, divided between its two predators. Soviet trains began rolling westward with grain, oil, manganese, and raw materials that would fuel Hitler's war machine. 1.5 million tons of grain, 900,000 tons of oil. The Soviets were feeding the beast that would soon turn on them. But beneath this transactional relationship, the incompatibility was fundamental and absolute. Hitler had written it plainly in Mein Kampf years earlier. Germany needed Lebensraum, living space in the east. The Slavic peoples were to be enslaved or exterminated, their lands colonized by German settlers. Ukraine's black soil would feed the Reich. The Caucasus oil would fuel its vehicles. Moscow would be flooded and turned into a lake. These weren't contingent plans. They were ideological necessities. Nazi racial theory demanded the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism and the conquest of the Soviet Union. No pact could paper over that fundamental reality. Stalin wasn't naive, but he was in denial about timing. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, intelligence warnings flooded into Moscow. Richard Sorgi, the Soviet spy embedded in the German embassy in Tokyo, sent repeated, specific alerts. German troop movements toward the Soviet border were unmistakable. By spring of 1941, over 3 million German and Axis soldiers were assembling along the frontier from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Reconnaissance flights violated Soviet airspace daily. German diplomats began evacuating their families. Yet Stalin dismissed every warning as provocation, as British manipulation designed to drag the Soviet Union into war. He trusted the pact because he needed to believe he had more time. November 1940 brought the relationship to its breaking point. Molotov traveled to Berlin for negotiations. Hitler wanted to discuss how Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union could divide the world between them. Molotov, however, had a different agenda. He demanded that Finland be placed entirely in the Soviet sphere. He wanted bases in Bulgaria. He wanted control of the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The meetings grew tense. At one point, British bombers struck Berlin, and the negotiations continued in Hitler's bomb shelter, the absurdity not lost on anyone. Hitler's expansive visions collided with Stalin's concrete demands. When Molotov left Berlin, Hitler's mind was made up. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 21 at his mountain retreat in Bavaria. The operation would be called Barbarossa, after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had led crusades to the east. The directive was explicit. The German armed forces must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. The invasion would begin in spring 1941. Secrecy was paramount. Planning would be restricted to the smallest possible circle. Even as the directive was being drafted, Soviet trains continued crossing into Germany, carrying the resources that would fuel the attack. The scale of the deception was staggering. Through the winter and spring of 1941, Germany orchestrated the largest military mobilization in history while maintaining the appearance of normal relations with the Soviet Union. Trade continued. Diplomats exchanged pleasantries. Stalin, desperate to avoid provocation, ordered his military not to respond to German border violations. When Soviet commanders warned of German preparations, they were accused of warmongering. The Western Military District, directly facing the German buildup, received orders not to occupy defensive positions, not to camouflage installations, not to do anything that might anger Hitler. Soviet units sat in their barracks while across the border, panzer divisions rehearsed their attack routes. The warnings kept coming, and Stalin kept dismissing them. In March 1941, the British warned of an imminent invasion. Stalin assumed it was a ploy to create conflict between Germany and the USSR. In April, a German communist and spy named Rudolf von Scheliha provided detailed information about Barbarossa, including approximate timing. Stalin ignored it. In May, Red Army intelligence reported over 100 German divisions massed near the border. Stalin ordered the report suppressed. On June 13th, TASS, the Soviet news agency, published an official communiqué, dismissing rumors of impending war as clumsily cooked-up propaganda by forces hostile to the USSR and Germany. It was one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in military history. June 21st, 1941, 11 p.m. The German ambassador in Moscow, Count Friedrich von der Schulenburg, received an urgent message from Berlin. At 4 a.m. the next morning, he was to deliver a declaration to Molotov. Schulenburg, who had advocated for maintaining the pact, knew what was coming. That night, Soviet freight trains crossed into German territory, carrying their scheduled deliveries of grain and raw materials. At the border, German soldiers watched them pass, knowing these would be the last peaceful hours. In the Kremlin, Stalin prepared for bed, confident that his pact would hold, that Germany wouldn't be foolish enough to fight a two-front war, that he had successfully bought time. In a few hours, 3 million German soldiers would prove him catastrophically wrong. The pact that couldn't last was about to shatter, and with it, the illusion that Stalin had controlled events. The largest military operation in human history was 5 hours away. Berlin, December 1940. In the Reich Chancellery's map room, enormous charts covered the walls showing a frontier that stretched 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, stood before these maps with a red pencil, tracing 3 massive arrows that would become the blueprint for the largest invasion in history. The arrows pointed east, deep into Soviet territory, converging on targets that had consumed months of heated debate. This wasn't just a military campaign. This was an attempt to destroy an entire nation in a single summer offensive. The audacity was breathtaking. The assumptions were fatal. The German plan drew from a century of military theory and 2 decades of bitter experience. After World War I, German officers had obsessively studied why they'd lost. They'd analyzed Hannibal's victory at Cannae, where Carthaginians encircled and annihilated a larger Roman army. They'd studied their own victory at Tannenberg in 1914, where Hindenburg and Ludendorff destroyed 2 Russian armies through double envelopment. The lesson seemed clear. Don't just defeat the enemy, annihilate him. Don't push him back, encircle him. The German word was Vernichtungsgedanke, the concept of annihilation. Fast-moving panzer divisions would punch through Soviet lines, race deep into the rear, then wheel and close the trap. Infantry would march behind to liquidate the pockets. In theory, the Red Army would cease to exist in 8 to 10 weeks. The operation would employ 3 army groups, attacking simultaneously across the entire front. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city and the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would punch through Belorussia, encircle Soviet forces near Minsk and Smolensk, then drive on Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would attack through Ukraine toward Kiev and the agricultural and industrial heartland beyond. The force assembled for this task was unprecedented. 3 million German and Axis soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, because even the Wehrmacht couldn't fully motorize, 3,600 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, 7,000 artillery pieces. It was the most powerful military force ever assembled. But beneath the surface confidence, fault lines had already appeared. The first problem was strategic focus. Hitler and his generals disagreed fundamentally about the campaign's objective. The professional military officers, Halder and his colleagues, believed Moscow was the key. It was the Soviet capital, the transportation hub where rail lines converged, the industrial center, the symbolic heart of communist power. Capture Moscow, and the Soviet state would collapse. Hitler disagreed. He considered economic targets paramount. Ukraine's grain would feed German armies. The Donbass coal would fuel German industry. The Caucasus oil fields were the ultimate prize. Without oil, the Soviet military machine would grind to a halt. Hitler's Directive Number 21 reflected this split thinking, ordering the destruction of Soviet forces while also emphasizing the capture of Leningrad and Ukraine's resources before the final push on Moscow. This ambiguity would prove catastrophic. The second problem was logistics, and it dwarfed everything else. German staff officers had calculated that their panzer divisions could operate effectively up to 600 kilometers from their supply bases. Beyond that distance, fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and mechanical breakdown would outpace the supply system's capacity. 600 kilometers was roughly the distance from the German-Soviet border to Minsk or to Smolensk. Moscow lay 800 kilometers from the border. The Caucasus oil fields were 2,000 kilometers away. The entire German supply system depended on trucks and railways, but Soviet railways used a different gauge than European railways. Every mile the Germans advanced, they would have to either convert the track or transfer supplies from train to truck. Soviet roads were primitive, unpaved tracks that turned to liquid mud in rain. The logisticians warned that the plan was marginally feasible in perfect conditions. Perfect conditions in war don't exist. The third problem was timing and weather. The campaign had to be completed before winter. German soldiers had no winter uniforms, no cold weather lubricants for their vehicles, no antifreeze for their engines. The planners had concluded this wouldn't matter because the campaign would be over by October. Staff studies estimated 8 to 10 weeks to destroy the Red Army west of the Dvina-Dnieper river line. Another 4 weeks to mop up remaining resistance and occupy key cities. By the time winter arrived, German soldiers would be in heated quarters in captured Soviet cities. The weather forecasts suggested the ground would be dry enough for mobile operations by mid-May. Hitler initially set the invasion date for May 15, 1941. Then the Balkans intervened. In spring of 1941, Hitler had to divert forces to save Mussolini's disastrous invasion of Greece and to secure Germany's southern flank. The Balkans campaign was quick and successful, but it consumed 5 crucial weeks. The new date for Barbarossa became June 22nd. Those 5 weeks would later be counted among the most consequential in military history. Every day of delay was a day closer to autumn rains and winter snows. But in the confidence of spring 1941, few German planners worried. The Red Army, they believed, was a hollow force crippled by Stalin's purges and humiliated by its poor performance against Finland in the Winter War. One good kick, Hitler declared, and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. The war games at Zossen headquarters outside Berlin had revealed worrying possibilities. In one exercise, the umpires concluded that Soviet forces would trade space for time, retreating into the vast interior rather than fighting encirclement battles on the frontier. If that happened, German supply lines would stretch to breaking point while the Soviets preserved their forces. The conclusion was dismissed. Soviet military doctrine emphasized offensive operations, not retreat. Stalin would order his armies to stand and fight. When they did, German panzer divisions would encircle and destroy them. The war games continued, and each time the German forces won decisively within the allotted time frame. The maps were rolled up. The plans were finalized. 3 million men would march east. By June of 1941, German confidence bordered on certainty. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, Norway in 2 months, France in 6 weeks. These weren't close victories. They were overwhelming triumphs. German doctrine, training, leadership, and equipment had proved superior to every opponent. Why would the Soviets be different? Intelligence estimates concluded that the Red Army possessed perhaps 200 divisions. In reality, the number was closer to 300. But even if intelligence had been accurate, it wouldn't have changed German plans. Superior quality would overcome quantity. Speed would overcome space. The German soldier, led by experienced officers and equipped with modern weapons, would shatter Soviet resistance before Stalin could react. The invasion routes had been meticulously planned. Army Group Center would use the historic invasion corridor through Belarusia, the flattest terrain offering the most direct route to Moscow. Army Group North would advance along the Baltic coast, where German naval support could assist. Army Group South would push through western Ukraine, then wheel southeast toward the Dnieper Bend and beyond. Each army group had specific objectives tied to the destruction of Soviet forces in its sector. Encirclement was the key. The panzer groups would race ahead, cutting off Soviet armies. The infantry would march behind, averaging 25 miles per day, closing the trap. The Luftwaffe would smash Soviet airfields, gaining air superiority in the first days. Then German bombers would strike retreating Soviet columns and interdict supply lines. Every element had been considered, coordinated, rehearsed. On the evening of June 21, 1941, the attack forces were in position. Soldiers who had been told for weeks they were engaged in the largest deception operation in history, preparing for an invasion of Britain, now learned the truth. They were going east. Many felt relief. They'd been terrified of crossing the English Channel under British naval and air power. Russia seemed easier. Officers read aloud Hitler's proclamation to the troops, declaring that they were saving European civilization from Bolshevik barbarism. At midnight, the final orders went out. 3 million men checked their weapons, wrote last letters home, and waited for dawn. In Berlin, the high command was confident. In 8 weeks, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. The planners had thought of everything, except what would happen if they were wrong. Minsk, May 1941. General Dmitry Pavlov sat in his headquarters at the Western Military District, the most critical command in the Soviet Union, and contemplated a decision that terrified him. His intelligence officers had brought him reconnaissance reports showing massive German troop concentrations across the border. Entire panzer divisions, artillery parks, supply dumps. The evidence was overwhelming. Pavlov knew he should order his forces to occupy defensive positions, disperse his aviation units, move ammunition to forward areas. But he also knew what had happened to officers who acted without explicit orders from Moscow. They'd been arrested, tried, and shot. Pavlov's predecessor had been executed 2 years earlier. So Pavlov did nothing and waited for permission that would never come. The Soviet military in 1941 was an institution still hemorrhaging from self-inflicted wounds. Between 1937 and 1939, Stalin's Great Purge had devastated the Red Army's leadership. 3 of 5 marshals were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were shot, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 corps commanders, 154 of 186 division commanders, 16 of 16 army commissars, 28 of 28 corps commissars. The charges were absurd: espionage, conspiracy, treason, plotting with foreign powers. The confessions were extracted through torture. The trials were show trials. The executions were real. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the Red Army's most innovative strategist, was tortured until he confessed to being a German agent, then shot. His execution set off a cascade of denunciations. Officers accused each other to save themselves. The chain of command collapsed into paranoia and terror. The purge's impact went far beyond the officers killed. It destroyed institutional knowledge, initiative, and trust. Junior officers who survived learned that caution was safer than competence. Following orders exactly was safer than showing initiative. In the Soviet military of 1941, an officer who exceeded his authority risked arrest, even if his actions were successful. An officer who followed orders exactly might survive even if those orders led to disaster. This cultural paralysis had consequences. The Red Army that faced Germany in June 1941 was led by men promoted far beyond their competence, appointed for political reliability rather than military skill. Many division commanders had been battalion commanders 2 years earlier. Many army commanders had been regimental officers. They'd never led forces of this size. They'd never been tested in modern warfare. Yet beneath this wreckage, strengths existed that German intelligence failed to appreciate. The Soviet Union had been preparing for war with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Defense industries had been evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains, placing them out of reach of German bombers. Tank production had reached extraordinary levels. In 1941 alone, Soviet factories would produce 6,300 tanks, more than German production that year. Many were obsolete models, mechanically unreliable and poorly armored. But some were revolutionary. The 34 medium tank, entering production in 1940, was superior to any German tank in armor, armament, and mobility. The KV-1 heavy tank was virtually impervious to German anti-tank weapons. The Soviets possessed 1,800 of these modern tanks by June 1941, a secret that would shock German tankers in the war's first weeks. The Red Army's size was also far larger than German intelligence estimated. The Germans believed they faced about 200 Soviet divisions. The actual number was over 300, with more in formation. But numbers meant nothing without proper organization, and Soviet military structure, in June 1941, was catastrophically flawed. Stalin's military theories emphasized offensive operations. Soviet doctrine called for immediate counterattacks, massive armored thrusts, carrying the war to the enemy's territory. Defensive warfare was considered defeatist thinking. This offensive obsession meant Soviet forces were postured entirely wrong for the war they were about to fight. Instead of defensive positions in depth, Soviet units were concentrated near the border. Instead of dispersed to survive initial attacks, they were clustered in obvious locations. Instead of stockpiling supplies for sustained operations, ammunition dumps and fuel depots were near the frontier where German bombers could destroy them. The mechanized corps exemplified the disaster. Stalin had ordered the creation of 30 mechanized corps, massive formations each containing over 1,000 tanks and 36,000 men. On paper, they were devastating offensive weapons. In reality, they were organizational chaos. Most were still forming when war began. They lacked radios, trucks, spare parts, trained crews. Tanks were scattered across vast areas without fuel or ammunition nearby. Commanders had trained on individual tank operation, but never on coordinating entire battalions or regiments. When orders came to concentrate these forces, they couldn't comply. Some units had tanks but no fuel. Others had fuel but no transport to move it. Still others had ammunition but no way to distribute it to dispersed companies. The Germans would later discover thousands of nearly new Soviet tanks abandoned without firing a shot, victims of this organizational collapse. Soviet intelligence had actually provided accurate warnings about Barbarossa's timing and scale. Richard Sorge in Tokyo sent over 50 messages detailing German intentions. Soviet military intelligence compiled reports from multiple sources confirming the invasion was imminent. Border guards reported constant German reconnaissance. Deserters from the German army crossed the lines with explicit warnings. But all this information collided with Stalin's conviction that Hitler wouldn't attack in 1941. Stalin believed Germany would first demand territorial or economic concessions, providing warning time for Soviet mobilization. He believed Hitler would finish Britain before opening an Eastern Front. Most fundamentally, Stalin believed he'd bought time with the Nazi-Soviet pact, and he couldn't accept that his calculations had failed. This denial created surreal scenes in the war's final hours. On June 13, 1941, TASS published an official denial of invasion rumors, calling them British provocations. On June 14, Stalin called a meeting with senior military leaders. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, the defense commissar, and General Georgy Zhukov, the chief of the general staff, warned that German attack was imminent. Stalin accused them of provocation. When they suggested putting border districts on alert, Stalin refused, saying it might provoke Germany. On June 21st at 6 p.m., a German soldier deserted and told Soviet border guards the attack would begin at 4 a.m. the next morning. The information reached Moscow. Stalin ordered that no actions be taken that might provoke the Germans. The final hours were a study in paralysis. At 11:30 p.m. on June 21st, Zhukov received reports of German troops removing border fortifications, of artillery units deploying to firing positions. He called Stalin. The Soviet leader, who'd gone to his dacha, was reluctant to come to the phone. When he finally did, Zhukov reported the situation and requested permission to order the border military districts to full combat alert. Stalin hesitated. He suggested this might be a provocation by German generals acting without Hitler's knowledge. At 12:30 a.m., he agreed to issue a warning order, but it was so hedged with restrictions as to be nearly useless. Don't respond to provocations. Don't cross the border. Don't open fire without permission. Take up defensive positions, but do it in a way that won't alarm the Germans. The order reached frontline units between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on June 22nd. Most commanders were reading it when German artillery opened fire. Across the Soviet frontier, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Red Army waited in positions that guaranteed disaster. Airfields had aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, perfect targets for German bombs. Armies were concentrated in vulnerable salients, pointing into German territory, ideal for encirclement. Communication systems depended on wire lines that would be cut in the first minutes. Fuel and ammunition were stored in centralized depots that German intelligence had already mapped. Officers who recognized the danger were paralyzed by orders not to provoke. Soldiers who might have fought had no ammunition issued and no orders to deploy. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, 1941, along 1,800 miles of frontier, German artillery batteries received the same signal. The targets were acquired. The shells were loaded. In the Soviet border towns, the inhabitants slept. In the military districts, General Pavlov and his counterparts waited for orders from Moscow. At 3:15 a.m., the orders became irrelevant. The largest artillery barrage in history erupted, and the Red Army's world ended. Brest Fortress, June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The first shells screamed out of the darkness and exploded among the stone barracks of the fortress complex, straddling the Bug River. Soviet soldiers, many asleep in their underwear, woke to a bombardment of such intensity that the ground itself seemed to heave. Along 1,800 miles of frontier, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 5,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was heard in villages 50 miles from the border. The earth shook. In the span of 30 minutes, the entire strategic balance of Europe shattered. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in human history, had begun. The German 45th Infantry Division's assault on Brest Fortress was supposed to be complete in hours. The fortress was old, built in the 19th century, militarily obsolete. Intelligence reported approximately 7,000 Soviet troops inside, caught completely unprepared. At 3:45 a.m., German assault teams stormed across the Bug River bridges under cover of the bombardment. They expected to find chaos and surrender. Instead, they found hell. Soviet soldiers, many barefoot and half-dressed, grabbed whatever weapons they could find and fought back with a ferocity that shocked the attackers. Machine guns firing from the fortress walls cut down German infantry. Soviet mortars, hastily manned, dropped shells on the bridges. What was supposed to take hours would take weeks. Some Soviet defenders would hold out for 32 days, fighting from the rubble long after the German army had swept hundreds of miles past them. But Brest was an exception. Across the vast front, the Soviet military structure was disintegrating. The Luftwaffe's first strikes hit 66 Soviet airfields at dawn. German bombers and fighters found Soviet aircraft parked in neat rows, unpainted, unprotected. Soviet pilots were asleep in their quarters. Anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. The slaughter was comprehensive. By noon on June 22nd, 1,200 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed. 800 of them never got off the ground. They burned in rows on their airfields while German fighters strafed the wreckage. By the end of the first day, the Red Air Force's western districts had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The Germans lost 35 aircraft. The Soviets lost 1,489. German fighters now owned the sky. Communication breakdown amplified the catastrophe. Soviet military communications depended on landlines, and German artillery had targeted the telephone exchanges first. Wireless communication was sparse. The Red Army had radios only at army and front level, not in divisions or regiments. Orders couldn't reach subordinate units. Reports couldn't reach headquarters. Commanders had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity. General Pavlov in Minsk tried desperately to contact his armies. The lines were dead. He sent liaison officers in vehicles. They drove into German spearheads and didn't return. By noon, Pavlov understood his entire front was collapsing, but couldn't tell anyone. By evening, German panzer columns were racing through gaps in the Soviet line that Pavlov didn't even know existed. In Moscow, the scale of the disaster took hours to penetrate the Kremlin's walls. At 7:15 a.m., Marshal Timoshenko called Stalin with confirmation that Germany had invaded. Stalin's first reaction was that this must be a provocation by rogue German generals. Hitler couldn't have authorized this. Timoshenko insisted the attack was occurring across the entire frontier. Stalin ordered him to find out what was happening and hung up. At 9 a.m., Molotov called the German ambassador, demanding an explanation. The ambassador, Count von der Schulenburg, read from a prepared statement declaring that Soviet troop concentrations had forced Germany to take preventative action. Molotov's response captured the moment's surreal quality. Surely we haven't deserved this? Stalin's response to catastrophe was paralysis. For 48 hours, he remained largely incommunicado, refusing to address the nation or even meet with his military commanders. Later accounts suggest he suffered a nervous breakdown. The man who'd ruled through terror now confronted a catastrophe beyond his control, triggered by his own miscalculations. While Stalin hid in his dacha, German tanks advanced, Soviet armies collapsed, and the administrative machinery of the Soviet state struggled to function without direction. Not until July 3rd would Stalin address the Soviet people by radio, his voice showing strain, beginning with words he'd never used before. "Brothers and sisters, I turn to you, my friends." The German advance in the war's first week exceeded even optimistic projections. Army Group Center's panzer groups, commanded by Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, punched through Soviet defenses and raced toward Minsk, 200 miles from the border. They covered the distance in 5 days. Behind them, Soviet armies tried to retreat, but had no orders, no coordination, no clear picture of where the Germans were. Entire divisions wandered through forests, trying to find their parent armies. Regiments marched east, directly into German ambushes. The roads became clogged with retreating soldiers, refugees, broken vehicles. German aircraft strafed these columns at will. By June 27th, German pincers closed around Minsk. 300,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. The first great encirclement was complete. Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states with equal speed. Soviet defenders in Lithuania and Latvia, many recently conscripted and barely trained, broke under the onslaught. The German 56th Panzer Corps advanced 50 miles on the first day. Kaunas fell on June 24th. By June 26th, German forces were across the Dvina River and driving toward Leningrad. The speed was intoxicating, dangerous. Supply columns couldn't keep pace. Tanks outran their fuel trucks. But the advance continued because Soviet resistance was fragmented, uncoordinated. Every breakthrough led to another. The horizon kept receding. Army Group South faced tougher fighting. Soviet forces in Ukraine were more numerous, better organized, and led by more competent commanders. The terrain was also less favorable for rapid advances. Marshy in the north, river crossings difficult. But even here, the pattern held. German tactical superiority told. Luftwaffe strikes shattered Soviet communications. German combined arms, tactics, tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft working in concert overwhelmed Soviet defenders still organized for pre-war doctrines. By the end of June, Army Group South had penetrated 100 miles, captured Lvov, and was approaching the old Stalin Line defenses. Everywhere, the Red Army was reeling. But even in catastrophe, signs of future trouble appeared. The German advance was fast, but not complete. Many Soviet units, when encircled, didn't surrender. They fought from the pockets with desperation that startled German soldiers accustomed to quick capitulation. Some encircled forces broke out eastward, suffering terrible casualties but preserving a core of experienced soldiers. Soviet tanks, when they engaged German forces, sometimes proved shockingly superior. The first encounters with 34 and KV tanks revealed that German anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate their armor. German tankers, confident in their Panzer III and IV models, discovered Soviet tanks shrugging off direct hits and destroying German vehicles with single shots. These were isolated incidents in the first week. Later, they'd become routine. The human cost, even in this week of German triumph, foreshadowed the carnage to come. Soviet casualties were catastrophic. 100,000 killed, 300,000 captured at Minsk. Entire divisions ceased to exist. But Germany was bleeding too. 25,000 German casualties in the first week, including 5,000 dead. These weren't the losses of a quick victory. They were the opening installment of a war of attrition. In Berlin, the High Command reviewed casualty reports with satisfaction. These losses were sustainable. They didn't yet understand they were reading the first page of a ledger that would eventually consume an entire army. On June 29th, 1 week into Barbarossa, Franz Halder wrote in his diary, "It is probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks. He was wrong. The campaign had barely begun, and the assumptions underlying that confidence were about to meet Russian space, Russian winter, and Russian determination. The world had cracked open on June 22nd. No one yet understood what would come crawling out. Minsk Pocket, June 29th, 1941. A Soviet sergeant from the 44th Rifle Division crawled through a wheat field, trying to orient himself by sound. German artillery fell methodically on the forest behind him. Machine gun fire stuttered in the distance. He'd lost contact with his company 2 days earlier, with his platoon yesterday morning. Now he was alone in a German-controlled landscape, trying to move east towards Soviet lines he hoped still existed. Behind him, 300,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in the Minsk Pocket, surrounded by German infantry that was methodically shrinking the perimeter. Above him, Luftwaffe aircraft circled, bombing any concentration of Soviet troops. The sergeant had no food, half a canteen of water, and 18 rounds for his rifle. He kept crawling east. Surrender wasn't an option. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was becoming known. The encirclement of Minsk was the first validation of German operational doctrine. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group had smashed through Soviet defenses, raced 200 miles east, then wheeled inward to close the trap behind the slower-moving Soviet armies. The speed was breathtaking. In 7 days, German armored spearheads had traveled farther than Napoleon's army had in a month. Soviet commanders, still trying to organize counterattacks against German positions from a week ago, discovered the Germans were now behind them. The 3rd, 4th, and 10th Soviet armies, attempting to retreat toward the Berezina River, found their escape routes blocked. By June 28th, the pocket was sealed. German infantry divisions, marching 25 miles per day in summer heat, arrived to compress the encirclement while the panzers raced farther east toward Smolensk. But liquidating the pocket proved harder than creating it. Soviet forces, facing annihilation, fought with a desperation that German soldiers had rarely encountered. Unlike French or Polish units the previous year, Soviet troops in the Minsk pocket didn't surrender en masse. They counterattacked, trying to break out eastward. They fought for individual villages with a ferocity that consumed days German planners had allocated to other operations. German soldiers discovered that wounded Soviet troops would wait until Germans approached to help, then detonate grenades, killing themselves and their captors. Stalin's Order No. 270, issued days earlier, had designated any Soviet soldier who surrendered a traitor. Their families would lose rations. They themselves would face execution if they returned. The choice was fight or die. Many chose both. The German Fourth Army, tasked with reducing the pocket, took a week to complete the job. 7 days of grinding combat, village by village fighting, forest clearance operations against Soviet soldiers who'd broken into small groups. By July 9th, organized resistance in the Minsk pocket ended. The haul was staggering. 323,000 prisoners, 3,300 tanks captured or destroyed, 3,600 artillery pieces. The Soviet Western Front had effectively ceased to exist. General Pavlov was recalled to Moscow, arrested, tried, and executed within 3 weeks. His crime was incompetence and cowardice. His real crime was being the scapegoat for Stalin's miscalculations. But even as the Minsk pocket was being liquidated, German advance elements were already creating the next encirclement at Smolensk. Guderian and Hoth, their panzer groups briefly refueled and resupplied, drove east from Minsk toward the critical road junction and communications hub of Smolensk. They covered the distance, another 200 miles, in 12 days. Soviet resistance stiffened. New Soviet armies appeared, pulled from reserve, hastily organized but increasingly competent. The terrain also changed. The relatively open ground of Belorussia gave way to more forested, marshy terrain that channelized movement and favored defense. Still, by July 16th, German pincers closed around Smolensk. Another 300,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. The Smolensk pocket, however, didn't close cleanly. Soviet forces had learned from Minsk. They didn't wait passively for encirclement. Soviet commanders ordered immediate breakout attempts. The 16th and 20th Soviet armies, trapped in the pocket, fought for 20 days while surrounded, launching repeated attacks to break the German ring. Some succeeded. Thousands of Soviet soldiers escaped eastward, suffering terrible casualties but preserving cadres around which new units could be formed. Soviet resilience was becoming apparent. These weren't armies that collapsed at the first setback. They were learning, adapting, and willing to accept catastrophic losses to buy time. The battles around Smolensk revealed emerging German problems. The panzer divisions, spearheading every advance, were wearing out. Tanks designed for Western European warfare were breaking down on Russian roads. Track links wore out, engines overheated, transmissions failed. German supply services hadn't brought adequate spare parts because the campaign was supposed to be over before they'd be needed. By late July, Army Group Center reported that only 50% of its tanks were operational. The other half sat in repair parks, waiting for parts that were still in Germany. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, which had begun Barbarossa with 900 tanks, had 400 operational by the end of July. Not from combat losses, from mechanical attrition. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. German logistics depended on trucks, and trucks depended on fuel. But fuel consumption rose exponentially with distance from railheads. By the time Guderian reached Smolensk, his supply columns were burning more fuel, delivering fuel than they were delivering. Soviet destruction of bridges and railways complicated everything. The Russian gauge rail system meant captured Soviet railways had to be converted before German trains could use them. Conversion teams worked around the clock but couldn't keep pace with the advance. Supplies began piling up at railheads hundreds of miles behind the front. Frontline units received 30% of their required ammunition and fuel. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Tank units conserved fuel for actual combat. Infantry divisions suffered a different crisis: exhaustion. German operational planning assumed infantry would march to contact, fight, then be transported to new positions. But Soviet space defeated this assumption. Infantry marched, fought, then marched again. They marched through Russian summer heat that reached 35 degrees Celsius. They marched on dirt roads that turned to choking dust. They marched carrying full combat loads, 60 pounds of equipment, rifles, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools. They marched 20 miles. They marched 25 miles. On some days, they marched 30 miles. Then they fought Soviet rearguards. Then they marched again. By late July, German infantry divisions reported 20% of their strength non-effective from exhaustion, foot injuries, and heat casualties. The remaining 80% were worn down, sleeping on their feet, sustained by willpower and the momentum of continuous victory. Yet the victories kept coming. The Smolensk pocket was sealed by August 5th. 310,000 more Soviet prisoners, 3,000 more tanks destroyed. The road to Moscow, now only 200 miles away, seemed open, but the campaign was already behind schedule. German planners had assumed the Red Army would be destroyed west of the Dnieper-Dwina river line by late July. It was now early August, and Soviet armies kept appearing. German intelligence had estimated 200 Soviet divisions at the war's start. By August, the Germans had encountered the equivalent of 360 divisions. Where were they coming from? How many more existed? In Moscow, Soviet factories worked around the clock, producing tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. New armies formed from Siberian divisions, from Central Asian reserves, from frantic mobilization. On July 19th, Hitler issued Directive No. 33, ordering a pause to consolidate gains. The panzer groups had outrun their infantry. Supply lines needed to catch up. Units needed maintenance, rest, refitting. The directive also revealed Hitler's growing impatience with the Moscow objective. He wanted Army Group Center's panzers diverted. Some would go north to help Army Group North capture Leningrad. Others would go south to help Army Group South encircle Soviet forces in Ukraine. Moscow could wait. His generals were appalled. Halder argued bitterly. Guderian flew to headquarters to protest personally. They were 200 miles from Moscow, with most of 2 months of good weather remaining. Diverting the panzers now meant abandoning the capital as an objective for 1941. Hitler was unmoved. The pause became a delay. The delay became a strategic reorientation. And the weather began changing. The long summer days were growing shorter. Autumn was coming. Wolf's Lair, East Prussia, August 21st, 1941. Franz Halder sat across from Adolf Hitler in the map room of the Führer's headquarters, fighting to control his anger. On the table between them lay maps showing German positions stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea. Halder pointed to Moscow, 200 miles from Army Group Center's forward positions. He argued with the cold logic of a general staff officer trained in operational art. Moscow was the transportation hub. All railways converged there. Capture Moscow, and Soviet logistics would collapse. Moscow was the political capital. Stalin's regime couldn't survive its loss. Moscow was within reach. 2 months of campaigning, weather remained. But Hitler jabbed his finger at Ukraine. He wanted Kiev. He wanted the Donbas industrial region. He wanted Ukrainian grain. The argument lasted hours. Hitler won. Halder returned to his office and wrote in his diary, "This so-called leadership is characterized by a pathological reaction to impressions of the moment." The decision to turn south was both strategically sound and operationally catastrophic. Hitler's economic logic was compelling. Germany was fighting a global war that would last years. Germany needed Ukraine's resources to sustain that war. The Donbas produced coal. The Dnieper Bend had hydroelectric power. Ukrainian farms grew wheat that could feed German armies. Without these resources, how would Germany continue fighting Britain, maintain occupation forces across Europe, and supply armies in the East? The professional military officers, focused on destroying the Red Army and capturing Moscow, dismissed economic concerns. Wars were won by destroying enemy forces, not by capturing wheat fields. But Hitler saw a longer game. The question wasn't whether Germany would defeat the Soviet Union, but whether Germany could sustain a multi-year global war against enemies that included Britain and potentially America. The operational execution of Hitler's decision was magnificent. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, pulled from the drive toward Moscow, wheeled south from the Smolensk region. Army Group South's 1st Panzer Group drove north from the Dnieper crossings. The two forces would meet east of Kiev, closing a pocket that would dwarf Minsk and Smolensk combined. But the diversion cost time. Guderian's panzers had to break contact with Soviet forces east of Smolensk, refit, refuel, then travel over 200 miles south before beginning the encirclement operation. Fuel shortages meant many vehicles were towed by tractors to conserve diesel. The movement consumed 2 weeks. 2 weeks when temperatures were dropping and daylight was shrinking. 2 weeks that would never be recovered. Soviet forces around Kiev walked into the trap partially because Stalin forbade retreat. The Southwestern Front, defending Ukraine, was the strongest Soviet force remaining in the field. Marshal Semyon Budyonny commanded over 600,000 troops organized in 5 armies. Intelligence officers warned Budyonny that German panzers were moving to encircle his forces. Budyonny requested permission to withdraw behind the Dnieper River before the trap closed. Stalin refused. Kiev must be held. Retreat was defeatism. When Budyonny persisted, Stalin removed him from command and replaced him with Marshal Timoshenko. Timoshenko also requested permission to withdraw. Stalin refused again. On September 12th, the German pincers were 40 miles apart and closing. On September 15th, Timoshenko sent a desperate message to Stalin: withdraw now, or the southwestern front would be destroyed. Stalin finally authorized retreat on September 17th. It was 2 days too late. September 16th, 1941. Near the town of Lokvitsa, east of Kiev, advance elements of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group met advance elements of 1st Panzer Group. The encirclement was complete. 5 Soviet armies, 665,000 men, were trapped. The Kiev pocket was the largest encirclement in military history, a distinction it still holds. The scale was almost incomprehensible. 665,000 men in a pocket roughly 80 miles across. They had food for perhaps a week, ammunition for less, no air support, no prospect of relief. And unlike earlier pockets, this one had no forests to hide in. The terrain around Kiev was relatively open. German artillery could reach almost any concentration. Luftwaffe bombers pounded the pocket around the clock. The Southwestern Front's destruction took 10 days. Soviet forces launched repeated breakout attempts toward the east. Some small groups succeeded, paying for every mile in blood. Most attempts failed. German infantry and artillery created killing zones at every likely breakout point. Soviet soldiers advanced into machine gun fire over open ground with depleting ammunition. By September 21st, organized resistance was fragmenting. By September 26th, it ended. The final count: 665,000 prisoners, 884 tanks destroyed, 3,242 artillery pieces captured. The entire Southwestern Front had ceased to exist. It was the greatest military disaster in history, greater than Cannae, greater than Sedan, greater than anything war had previously produced. Stalin's response was to execute the scapegoats. General Mikhail Kirponos, Southwestern Front commander, died trying to break out of the pocket. His political commissar and several army commanders were captured. Those who escaped were arrested upon reaching Soviet lines. The pattern established after Minsk repeated after Kiev. Commanders were blamed for defeats caused by Stalin's orders. The purge culture that had crippled the Red Army before the war now compounded its battlefield losses. Competent officers who'd survived German encirclement faced Soviet firing squads. Officers who might have learned from Kiev's mistakes were dead before they could apply those lessons. But the Kiev victory contained the seeds of German defeat. The operation consumed 3 weeks, from August 23rd to September 16th for the encirclement, then another 10 days to liquidate the pocket. Nearly a month when Army Group Center sat largely static around Smolensk, maintaining positions but not advancing. A month when Soviet forces retreated in front of Army Group North, but weren't pursued because those resources had been diverted south. A month when autumn approached with increasing certainty. By September 26th, when the last Soviet resistance in the Kiev pocket ended, it was already late September. Moscow was still 200 miles away. The Wehrmacht had won the largest battle in history. But they'd also lost something irretrievable: time. The weather was already changing. Nighttime temperatures fell toward freezing. Morning frost appeared on vehicles. The endless days of summer had shortened. By late September, darkness came at 7 p.m. The ground remained firm, but meteorologists warned that autumn rains typically began in October. Once the rains came, Russian roads would become impassable for weeks. The brief window between autumn mud and winter snow would offer perhaps 4 weeks of mobile warfare. Could Moscow be taken in 4 weeks? Hitler thought so. On September 6th, even before Kiev pocket was sealed, he'd issued Directive No. 35, Operation Typhoon, the final drive to Moscow. It would launch in early October with every available division. 3 million German soldiers had begun Barbarossa in June. Over 500,000 were now casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. The remainder were exhausted, undersupplied, and about to be committed to one final offensive before winter. They didn't have winter clothing. They didn't have cold weather oil for their vehicles. They didn't have a plan B if Typhoon failed. But they had victory disease, the confidence born of 18 months of unbroken triumph. Kiev was the culminating point of that confidence. Moscow would reveal its limits. Moscow approach. October 2nd, 1941. The rumble reached Soviet positions before dawn. Not artillery, something deeper, more continuous, a mechanical thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Soviet sentries strained their eyes toward the western horizon, seeing nothing in the pre-dawn darkness but hearing what sounded like the approach of every tank in the world. At 6 a.m., German artillery opened fire. At 7 a.m., 1,000 German tanks rolled forward across a 100-mile front. Operation Typhoon had begun. The Wehrmacht was making its final lunge toward the Soviet capital, throwing 1 million men, 1,400 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft at the two Soviet fronts, defending the approaches to Moscow. If this offensive succeeded, the war would end before winter. If it failed, the Wehrmacht would face something no German military planner had prepared for: combat in Russian winter. The opening days replayed the encirclement battles of summer with even greater efficiency. 3 German panzer groups attacked simultaneously. 3rd Panzer Group struck from the north toward Vyazma. 4th Panzer Group drove from the northwest. 2nd Panzer Group, Guderian's force, attacked from the south toward Bryansk. The Soviet Western Front and Reserve Front, defending the direct approach to Moscow, suddenly found themselves facing encirclement from 3 directions. Soviet commanders, Marshal Ivan Konev and Marshal Budyonny, recognized the danger and requested permission to retreat. Stalin, repeating the key of mistake, initially refused. By October 7th, it was too late. German pincers had closed around Vyazma, trapping 6 Soviet armies. To the south, around Bryansk, 3 more Soviet armies were encircled. The twin pockets contained over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The German High Command allowed itself to believe the war was won. In Berlin, press spokesman Otto Dietrich announced that the Soviet Union was destroyed and would never rise again. Newspapers published maps showing German advance units only 200 miles from Moscow. Halder wrote in his diary that the campaign had succeeded beyond all expectations. Guderian's forces were already past Bryansk and racing northeast toward Tula, the last major city before Moscow. The road seemed open. Soviet resistance seemed broken. Then, on October 10th, the weather changed. The temperature rose slightly, clouds gathered. At noon, the first drops fell. By evening, it was pouring. The Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, had arrived. Russian roads in 1941 weren't roads in the Western European sense. They were dirt tracks, often following routes that had existed since medieval times. In dry weather, they were passable, barely. In wet weather, they became liquid mud of a consistency and depth that had to be experienced to be believed. German vehicles sank to their axles. Tanks sank to their turret rings. Trucks attempting to pull out stuck vehicles became stuck themselves. Supply columns advancing from railroad 40 miles behind the front took 3 days to cover the distance. Some never arrived. Vehicles simply stopped in the mud and waited for tractors that never came. German soldiers discovered they could walk faster than their vehicles could drive. The panzer divisions, which had covered 200 miles in a week during summer, now measured advance in hundreds of meters per day. On October 14th, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group attempted to advance 10 miles toward Tula. After 8 hours of effort, lead tanks had moved 1 mile. Behind them stretched a column of vehicles, each separated from the next by 50 meters to avoid bunching, extending back 15 miles. The column wasn't moving forward, it was sinking into the earth. Soldiers dismounted and pushed, tractors pulled, engineers laid logs under tracks. Nothing helped. The mud was winning. Moscow's defenders gained desperate weeks from the mud. The Germans had encircled Vyazma and Bryansk, but liquidating those pockets in these conditions took much longer than planned. Soviet forces in the pockets fought with suicidal determination. Some units held for 2 weeks after encirclement. Others broke into small groups and tried to infiltrate east through German lines. The weather aided them. German security units, attempting to seal escape routes, found themselves as immobilized as the attackers. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers escaped from pockets that should have been death traps. They arrived in Moscow's defenses ragged, starving, and traumatized. But they could still hold a rifle. In Moscow itself, panic flared during the encirclement battles. The Soviet government prepared to evacuate. Foreign embassies burned documents. On October 16th, rumors spread that Stalin had fled. Riots erupted at railway stations as civilians tried to board eastbound trains. Workers abandoned factories. Government officials requisitioned vehicles and drove east. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, set up checkpoints to stop the flow. Some officials were arrested, some were shot on the spot. The city teetered on the edge of collapse. Then Stalin made a decision that changed everything. He would stay. On October 19th, Moscow was placed under siege conditions. Anyone leaving without authorization would be shot. Stalin's presence was announced repeatedly on radio. The panic subsided. If Stalin was staying, perhaps there was hope. Stalin also made his most critical military decision of the war. On October 10th, he placed Marshal Georgy Zhukov in command of the Western Front, the forces directly defending Moscow. Zhukov was the Soviet Union's best general, a peasant's son who'd risen through talent and ruthlessness. He defeated the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol in 1939. He understood mobile warfare. He also understood that defending Moscow required sacrificing everything else. Zhukov arrived at Western Front headquarters, assessed the situation, and began stripping forces from every other sector. Reinforcements came from Siberia, Central Asia, the Far East. New armies formed from factory workers, from students, from anyone who could hold a weapon. The German advance crept forward through the mud. By late October, forward elements of 3rd Panzer Group reached Kalinin, 80 miles northwest of Moscow. 4th Panzer Group approached to within 40 miles of the capital. Guderian's forces, fighting for Tula, were 60 miles south of Moscow. But the offensive had lost momentum. Supply situation was catastrophic. Panzer divisions that should have had 200 tanks operational had 50. Infantry divisions were scattered across vast frontages, trying to maintain contact with units miles away. The Luftwaffe, dominant in summer, found itself grounded by mud. Airfields became quagmires. Planes sank in the muck. Maintenance was impossible. German air superiority evaporated. October became November. The rain continued. Temperatures fluctuated around freezing. One day it snowed, the next it rained, turning everything into an icy slush. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms, began suffering from exposure. Frostbite cases appeared. Vehicles wouldn't start in morning cold. Oil congealed. Batteries died. Soldiers learned to light fires under engine blocks to warm them enough to start. The mud slowly hardened as temperatures dropped, but the ground wasn't freezing consistently. The Wehrmacht existed in a liminal state between mobility and stasis, strong enough to hold positions but too weak to advance decisively. Soviet resistance stiffened. New armies appeared on Moscow's approaches. The 33rd Army, the 43rd, the 49th, all freshly raised, dug in across the highways leading to Moscow. They weren't well equipped or well trained, but they had numbers and determination. German intelligence continued to be shocked by Soviet ability to create new forces. How many divisions had they destroyed? How many prisoners had they taken? Yet still new Soviet armies appeared. German logisticians calculated that the Soviet Union should have run out of tanks months ago. Yet Soviet tanks kept attacking. The truth, invisible to German intelligence, was that Soviet factories beyond the Urals were producing 1,000 tanks per month. Stalin had moved over 1,500 factories east in the war's first months, a logistical achievement far exceeding anything Germany managed. Those factories were now producing. By the end of October, Operation Typhoon had created the twin pockets at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing another 600,000 Soviet soldiers. It had advanced German lines to within 40 miles of Moscow, but it hadn't broken through. It hadn't caused Soviet collapse, and it had consumed irreplaceable time. November arrived with temperatures dropping steadily. The mud began to freeze solid. Soon, mobile operations would resume, but for how long? Winter was approaching with the certainty of doom. And in Siberia, in Central Asia, in garrisons along the Soviet-Japanese border, divisions were moving west. Fresh divisions, winter-equipped divisions. They were coming to Moscow, and they were coming soon. The Germans could see the Kremlin spires on clear days, but they couldn't reach them. And now, time had run out. Moscow sector, November 7th, 1941. A German soldier from the 7th Panzer Division woke before dawn to discover his rifle bolt frozen solid. The metal had contracted in the night cold, and moisture had turned to ice in the mechanism. He couldn't chamber a round. Around him, other soldiers faced the same problem. Machine guns wouldn't fire. Vehicle engines wouldn't turn over. The thermometer read -20°C, and it was only early November. The soldier wore the same uniform he'd worn advancing through summer heat. A wool tunic, regular trousers, standard boots, no winter coat, no insulated gloves. The supply officers had promised winter equipment would arrive soon. It was somewhere behind them, delayed at a railroad, or maybe still in Germany. The soldier wrapped himself in a blanket taken from a destroyed Soviet village and tried to start a fire. The wind extinguished it immediately. This was his introduction to Russian winter. He would be dead from frostbite within 3 weeks. The cold arrived suddenly and with devastating force. Early November brought the first serious frost. By mid-November, temperatures plunged to -30°C. By early December, -35. German soldiers had never experienced cold like this. Most came from central or western Germany, where winter meant occasional snow and temperatures around freezing. Russian winter meant something altogether different. It meant cold that burned exposed skin in minutes, cold that turned steel brittle, cold that made rubber crack, cold that killed as efficiently as bullets. And the Germans faced it in summer uniforms because someone in the supply chain had decided winter equipment wasn't necessary for a campaign that would end in October. The mechanical failures came first. German vehicles, designed for European conditions, began dying en masse. Engine oil thickened to the consistency of tar. Cooling systems, filled with water instead of antifreeze, froze and cracked engine blocks. Batteries lost charge overnight and couldn't be recharged because the charging systems didn't work in extreme cold. Transmission fluid congealed. Hydraulic systems failed. Tank crews learned to keep engines running continuously because once stopped, they might never start again. But continuous running consumed fuel at catastrophic rates, fuel that couldn't be delivered because the fuel trucks wouldn't start. By late November, German mechanized units were losing more vehicles to cold than to combat. The horses died even faster. The Wehrmacht, despite its image as a fully motorized force, depended heavily on horse-drawn transport. 750,000 horses had entered the Soviet Union in June. By December, hundreds of thousands were dead. Horses couldn't survive on the sparse forage available in occupied Soviet territories. German logistics hadn't planned for feeding this many animals through winter. Horses froze to death in their harnesses overnight. They collapsed from starvation while pulling supply wagons. Dead horses lined the roads, sometimes stacked in piles where they'd fallen. Without horses, artillery couldn't move. Supply wagons couldn't operate. The Wehrmacht's mobility, already crippled by vehicle failures, now ceased entirely in many sectors. But the human casualties were the most horrific. Frostbite became epidemic. German soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper and straw, trying to insulate their inadequate boots. It didn't help. Toes turned black, fingers became numb and wouldn't regain feeling. Men urinated on their hands to warm them briefly. Entire companies reported 50% frostbite casualties. Medical services, already overwhelmed by combat casualties, couldn't handle the flood of cold injuries. Evacuation hospitals filled with men whose feet were rotting, whose fingers had to be amputated, whose faces showed black patches of dead tissue. By the end of December, the German army would record over 100,000 frostbite casualties. These weren't men who would return to duty. These were permanent losses. The weapons failures compounded everything. German small arms, precision engineered for European conditions, seized up in Russian cold. Bolt-action rifles, the standard infantry weapon, became single-shot weapons because frozen bolts couldn't be operated. Machine guns fired a burst, then jammed as moisture froze in the mechanism. Mortars cracked from thermal stress. Artillery recoil mechanisms froze. German soldiers discovered that Soviet weapons, cruder but more robust, continued functioning in conditions that disabled German equipment. PPS submachine guns, cheap stamped metal weapons distributed to Soviet troops by the million, kept firing. Mosin Nagant rifles, designed for Siberian winters, operated reliably. German soldiers began collecting Soviet weapons from battlefields because they worked better than German weapons. December 1st, 1941. A German reconnaissance patrol from the 258th Infantry Division reached the village of Khimki on Moscow's northwestern outskirts. Through binoculars, they could see the spires of the Kremlin 7 miles away. They'd come 900 miles from the German border. They'd defeated every Soviet army that opposed them. Moscow lay before them, closer than any German soldier had come, and they could advance no farther. Behind them, their division was scattered across 50 miles, strung out along frozen roads. Ammunition was rationed. Food was scarce. Reinforcements were non-existent. The patrol took photographs of the Kremlin view, then withdrew. They'd reached the high water mark of German advance. From this point, everything would be retreat. But the cold also brought Soviet reinforcements that would prove decisive. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, had confirmed in October that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. Japan was preparing for war with America, not Russia. This single piece of intelligence unlocked enormous military resources. Stalin had kept 40 divisions in Siberia and the Far East, guarding against Japanese attack. Now those divisions could move west. 18 divisions, over 250,000 men, began rail movement to Moscow in November. These weren't hastily raised militia. These were veteran units, fully equipped, trained for winter warfare. They wore quilted jackets and fur hats. Their tanks had winter lubricants. Their weapons functioned in extreme cold. They'd been waiting their entire military careers for this moment. The contrast between German and Soviet forces in December 1941 was stark. German soldiers, freezing and starving, barely held positions. Soviet soldiers, warmly clothed and adequately fed, prepared to attack. The Germans had traveled 900 miles to reach Moscow's suburbs. The Soviets had traveled 3,000 miles from Siberia but arrived ready to fight. German tanks, when they could move, operated at 30% strength. Soviet factories delivered new 34 tanks faster than old ones were destroyed. German aircraft sat grounded on frozen airfields. Soviet aircraft, designed with skis for winter operations, flew daily. The Wehrmacht had won every battle for 6 months. Now, the Red Army was about to demonstrate that winning battles wasn't the same as winning wars. Zhukov, commanding Moscow's defense, watched the German advance grind to a halt and recognized the opportunity. The Germans were overextended, undersupplied, and frozen. Their lines were thin. Their reserves were exhausted. Every German soldier was committed to frontline positions because there was nowhere else for them to be. Zhukov, meanwhile, had been accumulating reserves throughout November. 3 new armies, 5 rifle divisions, multiple tank brigades, over 1 million men total defending Moscow, and the Germans didn't know about half of them. Soviet deception had hidden the Siberian division's arrival. German intelligence believed Soviet forces around Moscow were weaker than they actually were. German commanders thought they faced a defeated enemy making a last stand. They were about to discover they faced a fresh enemy preparing an offensive. The psychological impact of November and December cannot be overstated. German soldiers, who'd marched from victory to victory for 18 months, now faced an enemy they couldn't defeat and conditions they couldn't survive. Letters home, censored by German authorities but later recovered, revealed spreading demoralization. Soldiers wrote about friends freezing to death in their sleep, about horses dying in harness, about watching Soviet tanks shrug off German anti-tank rounds, about seeing endless Soviet reinforcements when intelligence had promised Soviet forces were destroyed. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, was cracking. Not from defeat in battle, but from something more insidious, the growing realization that they couldn't win. December 5th approached. The temperature stabilized around -30 Celsius. The ground was frozen, solid, hard as concrete. Mobile operations were again possible. German commanders prepared for what they assumed would be final defensive positions before resuming offensive operations in spring. They'd hold through winter, receive reinforcements and equipment, then finish the job next year. That was the plan. But across the lines, in forest camps and village cellars, Soviet soldiers sharpened bayonets and checked ammunition. 3 Soviet fronts, Kalinin, Western, and Southwestern, prepared to attack simultaneously. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 700 divisions. The counteroffensive that would change the war was hours away, and the Germans, focused on their own survival, had no idea it was coming. The cold had nearly killed them. Now it would enable their enemy to strike back. Kalinin Front, northwest of Moscow, December 5, 1941, 4 a.m. Soviet artillery shattered the frozen darkness with a bombardment that extended along 200 miles of front. 5,000 guns, firing in a choreographed sequence that had been rehearsed for 2 weeks, poured shells onto German positions. In trenches and bunkers hastily dug into frozen ground, German soldiers who'd been sleeping in shifts woke to apocalypse. The ground heaved, trees splintered, log bunkers collapsed. Men screamed for medics who couldn't reach them through the barrage. This wasn't harassing fire. This was systematic destruction. And when it lifted after 30 minutes, Soviet infantry emerged from the forests. Behind them came tanks, their engines running, exhaust streaming in the cold air. The Moscow counteroffensive had begun. The Soviet plan was ambitious and coordinated in ways German intelligence hadn't believed the Red Army could manage after 6 months of defeats. 3 fronts would attack simultaneously. General Ivan Konev's Kalinin Front would strike from the north. Zhukov's Western Front would attack from Moscow itself, straight west. General Yakov Cherevichenko's Southwestern Front would drive from the south. The objectives were to push German forces away from Moscow, recapture key towns, and if possible, encircle and destroy major German formations. The forces committed were massive, 720,000 Soviet troops attacking 830,000 Germans. But the Germans were frozen, scattered, and exhausted. The Soviets were concentrated, equipped for winter, and driven by 6 months of accumulated rage. The northern assault by Kalinin Front targeted the German Ninth Army, holding a salient toward Moscow from the northwest. Soviet 29th and 31st Armies hit the German positions with a fury that stunned the defenders. German soldiers, many suffering from frostbite, tried to man weapons that didn't work in the cold. Machine guns jammed after bursts, rifles froze, radios wouldn't function. Communication broke down immediately. Soviet infantry, advancing in the classic Russian style, absorbed casualties and kept coming. Behind them, 34 tanks crashed through German strongpoints. German anti-tank guns scored hits that bounced off Soviet armor. By noon on December 5th, Soviet forces had penetrated 5 miles. By evening, they'd captured Kalinin itself, the first major city retaken since the war began. Zhukov's Western Front attacked along multiple axes. The 16th Army struck toward Klin, northwest of Moscow. The 5th Army drove towards Zvenigorod. The 33rd Army pushed toward Narofominsk. The 1st Shock Army, a new formation specially created for urban warfare, attacked directly west. Everywhere, German lines buckled. Not because German soldiers wouldn't fight, they fought desperately, but because they were outnumbered, frozen, and their weapons weren't functioning. German commanders called for reinforcements. There were no reinforcements. They called for air support. The Luftwaffe was grounded by weather and fuel shortages. They called for permission to retreat. Hitler's headquarters responded with orders to hold every position. Retreat was forbidden. December 10th. Soviet forces recaptured Yelets, south of Moscow, after 3 days of fierce fighting. The German 34th Corps, defending the city, had been ordered to hold at all costs. They'd held for 72 hours, then broken when Soviet tanks encircled the city from the north and south. The survivors retreated west in disorder, abandoning equipment and wounded. It was the Wehrmacht's first major retreat since 1918. Officers who'd spent their entire careers studying how to advance now had to learn how to withdraw under pressure. They weren't prepared. German doctrine emphasized attack. Defensive operations were improvised. The crisis on Army Group Center's flanks grew critical. To the north, 9th Army was being pushed back toward the Volga Reservoir. To the south, 2nd Panzer Army, Guderian's force, was retreating from Tula. The center held, but both flanks were crumbling. If the flanks collapsed completely, the entire army group would be encircled. The scenario that had befallen so many Soviet armies was now threatening the Germans. Field Marshal von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, requested permission to conduct strategic withdrawal to shorter, defensible lines. Hitler refused. On December 16th, he issued his infamous Stand Fast order. No retreat. Every soldier would hold his current position. Anyone retreating without explicit orders would be court-martialed. Units surrounded would fight in place until relieved. The Stand Fast order probably saved Army Group Center from complete disintegration. German units, forbidden to retreat, organized hedgehog defenses in villages and towns. They fought from buildings heated by stoves, torn from local homes. They created interlocking fields of fire. They used the few operational tanks as mobile reserves, rushing them from crisis point to crisis point. The Soviet advance, rapid in the first week, began slowing. Soviet logistics, never efficient, couldn't keep pace with the advance. Soviet units outran their supply lines. Ammunition ran short. Food became scarce. The troops that had started the offensive fresh were now tired. The pattern that had plagued German advances now afflicted Soviet ones. Success brought its own problems. But the psychological impact was seismic. For the first time since 1939, the German army was retreating under enemy pressure. Town names that had been German victory announcements in October and November now became Soviet liberation announcements in December. Klin fell on December 15th. Kaluga on December 20th. Volokholamsk on December 20th. Each recaptured town was a propaganda victory Stalin could announce to the world. The Red Army wasn't destroyed, it was attacking. Moscow wasn't falling, it was being defended. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed, it was fighting back. German casualties mounted catastrophically. From December 1st to January 31st, Army Group Center would report 170,000 casualties, 40,000 killed, over 100,000 wounded or missing. Frostbite casualties added another 60,000. These weren't losses that could be easily replaced. The Eastern Front was consuming the Wehrmacht's most experienced troops, its best officers, its irreplaceable specialists. A German infantry company that began Barbarossa with 180 men might have 60 effectives by January. The missing weren't coming back. They were dead in Russian snows, captured in Soviet POW camps, or in German hospitals missing limbs to frostbite. Soviet casualties were even higher, as always. From December 5th through January 7th, the counteroffensive cost the Red Army over 100,000 dead and 300,000 wounded. But Soviet losses, horrific as they were, could be replaced. Soviet factories produced. Soviet training centers graduated. Soviet population reserves absorbed losses that would have destroyed smaller nations. Germany had 80 million people. The Soviet Union had 190 million. Germany was fighting a war of attrition it couldn't win. The mathematics of sustained combat favored the defender. And now the defender was attacking. December 19th, Hitler relieved Field Marshal von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the army and assumed personal command. He also dismissed von Bock, replaced Guderian, and removed multiple other commanders who'd argued for retreat. Hitler would now personally direct operations on the Eastern Front. The message was clear. The Wehrmacht's defeat at Moscow was the general's fault. Hitler's leadership would prevent further disasters. In reality, Hitler's assumption of direct command ensured that German military strategy would be dictated by ideological obsession rather than operational reality. But in December 1941, that consequence wasn't yet apparent. What was apparent was that the invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped, pushed back, and forced onto the defensive by an enemy it had declared destroyed. January 7th, 1942, the Soviet winter offensive reached its culminating point. Soviet forces had pushed German lines back between 100 to 150 miles across the entire Moscow sector. Dozens of towns had been liberated. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians were freed from German occupation. The immediate threat to Moscow was eliminated. But the offensive hadn't achieved its ultimate objective, the encirclement and destruction of Army Group Center. German forces, though battered, remained intact. They'd formed a continuous line. They held key cities like Rzhev and Vyazma. The opportunity for a decisive victory had passed. Soviet forces, exhausted and outrun from their supplies, couldn't maintain offensive pressure. The front stabilized. Both sides prepared for winter stalemate. Stalin, emboldened by success, ordered a general offensive across the entire Eastern Front. not just at Moscow, but at Leningrad, in Ukraine, everywhere. Zhukov and other commanders argued this was overreach. The Red Army had succeeded around Moscow because it concentrated forces. Attacking everywhere meant attacking nowhere. Decisively, Stalin overruled them. Through January and February, Soviet forces launched attacks along the entire front. Most failed with heavy losses. The Germans, though defensive, still knew how to fight. Soviet inexperience in offensive operations showed. Attacks were poorly coordinated. Artillery support was inadequate. Infantry advanced into prepared killing zones. The winter offensive that had started so promisingly at Moscow ended in February with mixed results. Moscow was saved, but Army Group Center survived. And spring, when Germany could resume offensive operations, was coming. Leningrad, January 1942. A woman stood in line outside a bakery on Nevsky Prospect, the city's main avenue, waiting to receive her daily bread ration. 125 grams, 4 ounces, a slice and a half. This was all the food the city could provide to civilians not engaged in essential work. She'd been standing in line for 3 hours in temperatures of -30°C. 2 people ahead of her had collapsed and died while waiting. Their bodies lay by the curb, frozen solid, waiting for the twice-daily collection by trucks that took the dead to common graves. The woman was 42 years old. She'd been a schoolteacher before the war. Now, she weighed 80 pounds. Her daughter had died last week from starvation. Her husband was somewhere in the Soviet army. She hadn't heard from him since September. When she reached the counter, received her bread, and walked home, she would eat half immediately and save half for tomorrow. This was life in Leningrad. 900 days of siege. 1,200,000 people would die, most of them from hunger. The Leningrad blockade was the longest and deadliest siege in modern history. German and Finnish forces had surrounded the city in September 1941. Hitler's orders were explicit. Leningrad would not be captured by assault. It would be starved into submission, then leveled. The city's population of 3 million, swollen with refugees, became trapped. The only supply route was across Lake Ladoga, which the Germans subjected to constant artillery fire and air attack. In winter, when the lake froze, trucks could drive across the ice. The Road of Life, as it became known, operated under desperate conditions. Trucks broke through weak ice regularly. German artillery shelled the route, but the trucks kept running because they were the city's only lifeline. January 1942 was the worst month. Daily death rate exceeded 3,000 people. Hospitals filled with dystrophy cases, the medical term for starvation. People collapsed on streets and died where they fell. Cannibalism occurred, though Soviet authorities suppressed information about it. The NKVD arrested over 2,000 people for using human flesh as food. Bodies were robbed of their ration cards. Some killings occurred specifically to obtain ration cards. The city descended into a horror that defied comprehension. Yet Leningrad held. Factories continued operating, producing artillery shells and tank parts with workers too weak to stand. The Kirov plant kept manufacturing tanks even as its workers starved. Orchestras performed. The famous Leningrad premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony occurred in August 1942, performed by an orchestra whose members were so weak from hunger they had to be helped onto the stage. The starvation siege revealed the war's exterminatory character. This wasn't warfare as Clausewitz understood it, politics by other means. This was ideological war aimed at the destruction of populations. Hitler had declared that Leningrad, cradle of Bolshevism, would be wiped from the earth. Its population would die. The city would be razed. What would replace it, Hitler suggested, should be swampland. This wasn't a strategic objective. This was genocide through starvation. The Wehrmacht commanders who implemented the siege understood this. They were complicit in mass murder. German soldiers sat in positions watching Leningrad starve, receiving orders that any civilians attempting to escape through German lines would be shot. Thousands were. Far to the south, the winter stalemate took a different form. The front lines had stabilized roughly where the Moscow counteroffensive had pushed them. German forces held a continuous line from Leningrad to the Black Sea, but it was a line riddled with salients and weak points. Soviet forces held some German-occupied territory in the form of pockets and penetrations. Both sides were exhausted. German units were at 50% strength or less. Soviet units had suffered enormous casualties in winter attacks. Neither side could mount major offensive operations. Instead, they engaged in localized attacks, trying to improve positions, straighten lines, capture tactically important terrain. The fighting was constant but inconclusive. The spring Rasputitsa brought both sides to a virtual halt. March and April saw the ground thaw, creating mud even worse than autumn. Vehicles couldn't move. Artillery couldn't be displaced. Infantry slogged through knee-deep muck. Supply operations collapsed. For 6 weeks, the Eastern Front entered a strange limbo. Major operations were impossible. Both sides used the time to rest, refit, and plan. German planners, analyzing the winter's disasters, concluded they couldn't fight another winter in Russia without proper preparation. Winter clothing, vehicle winterization, cold weather lubricants, all these had to be stockpiled before next winter. Soviet planners, analyzing their winter victories and spring failures, concluded they'd learned hard lessons about offensive operations. The Red Army wasn't yet capable of destroying large German formations in mobile warfare, but it had learned it could survive, counterattack, and force Germans backward. Intelligence debates consumed both sides. German intelligence had drastically underestimated Soviet strength in 1941. How could they avoid repeating that mistake? Soviet intelligence tried to predict where Germany would attack in summer 1942. Moscow, again, or somewhere else. Stalin convened planning conferences throughout spring. Some commanders argued Germany would try again for Moscow. They'd come so close in 1941, surely they'd complete the job. Others argued Germany would turn south toward the oil fields. The Caucasus oil was essential to Soviet war production. Without it, Soviet tanks would halt. Stalin listened to competing assessments, made notes, and withheld his judgment. He'd been catastrophically wrong in 1941. He didn't intend to repeat that error. In Germany, Hitler presided over similar debates. The generals wanted to finish Moscow. The capital remained the primary objective. Capture Moscow, and Soviet logistics and government would collapse. Hitler disagreed. He'd become obsessed with economic targets. Germany needed Soviet oil. Germany needed Ukrainian grain. Germany needed to deny these resources to Stalin while securing them for the Reich. The southern option made economic sense. It also appealed to Hitler's worldview. The South meant conquest of inferior peoples, seizure of their lands and resources, everything his ideology promised. Moscow was a symbolic target. The Caucasus oil fields were an existential necessity. In April 1942, Hitler made his decision. The summer offensive would go south. The decision would be formalized in Directive No. 41, issued April 5, 1942. The operation would be called Case Blue, Fall Blau. Army Group South would drive east toward the Don River, then turn southeast toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus beyond. The objectives were explicit. Capture the Maikop and Grozny oil fields, then drive to Baku. Cut Soviet oil supplies. Secure oil for Germany. It was rational strategic planning based on Germany's resource situation. It was also the beginning of the chain of decisions that would lead to Stalingrad and catastrophe. But in spring 1942, Stalingrad was just another city on the Volga, of no particular importance. No one predicted it would become a graveyard. Both sides spent spring and early summer preparing. Germany assembled forces in southern Russia and Ukraine, over 1 million men, 1,600 tanks, 1,700 aircraft. The concentration was obvious. Soviet intelligence reported it continuously. Stalin, remembering his failure to believe intelligence in 1941, this time believed it. But he made a different error. He thought the southern offensive was a feint. The real attack, he convinced himself, would come at Moscow. Stalin positioned his best armies and his strategic reserves to defend Moscow. The south received less priority. Marshal Timoshenko commanded the southwestern direction, defending Ukraine and the Don. He had adequate forces for defense, but not for the offensive operations Stalin kept ordering. Stalin wanted Ukraine retaken before Germany could attack. Timoshenko tried to explain that attacking with insufficient forces against a German buildup was suicidal. Stalin insisted. May 1942 brought disaster even before Case Blue began. Stalin ordered a major offensive to recapture Kharkov, Ukraine's second city. Timoshenko launched the attack with 27 divisions. German forces defending Kharkov absorbed the initial assault, then counterattacked from the flanks. The Soviet penetration became a pocket. By May 29th, the disaster was complete. Over 200,000 Soviet casualties. It was another Minsk, another Kiev, another catastrophic encirclement. The very eve of Germany's summer offensive, the Red Army in the south had just destroyed itself through Stalin's overconfidence. When Case Blue launched 6 weeks later, Soviet forces defending the south would be depleted, demoralized, and disorganized. The road to Stalingrad was opening, and Stalin, having spent 1941 trusting Hitler, now spent 1942 trusting his own worst instincts. The pattern of Soviet disaster, followed by recovery, repeated throughout 1941, was about to replay on an even larger scale. But first would come the disasters. Voronezh Sector, June 28, 1942. Oberst Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, commanding the 16th Panzer Division's armored regiment, stood in the turret of his command tank, watching the Russian steppe roll past. His division had crossed the start line at dawn. Now, 12 hours later, they'd advanced 40 miles. Soviet resistance was scattered, confused. Entire Soviet divisions retreated without fighting. When Soviet forces did engage, German combined arms tactics shattered them quickly. Strachwitz had fought through Poland, France, and the 1941 campaign. This felt different. Not easier, exactly, but more fluid, less desperate. The Wehrmacht had learned from the previous year's mistakes. Summer 1942 would be different. They'd advance sustainably. They'd maintain supply lines. They'd reach objectives without outrunning logistics. They'd capture the Caucasus oil fields before winter. The colonel watched dust clouds from his advancing columns, stretched to the horizon, and allowed himself to believe victory was still possible. Case Blue began with Army Group South split into two components, Army Group A and Army Group B. The operation would occur in phases. First, German forces would drive east to the Don River, destroying Soviet forces in southern Russia. Second, Army Group A would turn southeast toward the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group B would drive towards Stalingrad, covering Army Group A's northern flank. The plan was logical, sequential, careful. Unlike Barbarossa's reckless assumptions, Case Blue incorporated lessons from 1941. Logistics was emphasized. Objectives were realistic. The timeline extended across the entire summer. Hitler had learned something from the previous year's failures. Not enough, as events would prove, but something. The offensive opened with overwhelming success. German and Romanian forces struck toward Voronezh, a city on the Don River. Soviet defenses, weakened by the Kharkov disaster, crumbled. The 40th and 6th Soviet armies attempted to hold, then retreated in disorder. German tanks advanced faster than Soviet forces could retreat. But something was different from 1941. Soviet forces weren't standing to fight encirclement battles. They were trading space for time, falling back before German pincers could close. Stalin had issued Order Number 227, not one, step back. Retreat was forbidden without authorization, but commanders interpreted this flexibly. Unauthorized retreat was treason. But authorized withdrawal to new defensive lines was perfectly acceptable. Soviet forces retreated, defended briefly, then retreated again. They were infuriating German commanders with Fabian tactics, refusing the decisive battle Germany needed. July 23, 1942, Rostov-on-Don, the gateway to the Caucasus, fell to German forces after 10 days of fighting. The capture should have been celebrated as a major victory. Instead, it revealed a problem. The pocket that should have contained hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops was largely empty. Soviet forces had escaped. They'd retreated across the Don, blown the bridges, and established new defensive lines. German intelligence estimated they'd destroyed 3 Soviet armies. In reality, those armies had withdrawn intact, depleted but not destroyed. The encirclement doctrine that had worked so devastatingly in 1941 wasn't working in 1942. Soviet commanders had learned. They'd accepted territorial losses to preserve their forces. the Wehrmacht could advance. But it couldn't annihilate. Hitler, watching Case Blue's progress from his headquarters in East Prussia, grew impatient. The offensive was succeeding, but not decisively. Soviet resistance wasn't collapsing. Where were the mass surrenders? Where were the enormous pockets? Hitler decided the plan wasn't ambitious enough. On July 23rd, the same day Rostov fell, he issued Directive Number 45. Army Group A would drive toward the Caucasus oil fields as planned, but simultaneously, Army Group B would capture Stalingrad. Not bypass it, capture it. The city was an industrial center. It bore Stalin's name. Its fall would be a propaganda victory. Also, capturing Stalingrad would secure the Volga River, blocking Soviet supplies from the north. The strategic logic was defensible. The operational problem was enormous. Hitler was dividing his forces, sending them toward objectives 500 miles apart. Every principle of war counseled against this. Concentrate force. Don't divide objectives. Hitler disregarded these principles. Army Group A began its drive south in late July. 1st Panzer Army and 17th Army crossed the Don and plunged into the Caucasus foothills. The advance was spectacular. Soviet resistance in the region was thin. The terrain was difficult, mountainous in places, but German mountain troops had trained for this. By August 10th, German forces had captured Maikop, the first major oil field. They found the installations thoroughly destroyed. Soviet engineers had demolished the derricks, pumps, and refineries before retreating. It would take months to restore production. Still, Maikop was captured. Grozny, the next objective, lay 200 miles southeast. Baku, the ultimate prize, was 400 miles beyond that. The distances were staggering. Supply lines stretched across increasingly hostile terrain, but Army Group A kept advancing. In Berlin, mapmakers placed pins, showing German forward positions deep in the Caucasus. It looked impressive. On the ground, it meant stringing combat units across vast spaces with minimal reserves and no depth. Meanwhile, Army Group B approached Stalingrad from the west. The 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was Germany's largest field army. Over 300,000 troops, 700 tanks, Luftwaffe support. Paulus was methodical, professional, competent, but unimaginative. He followed orders precisely. His orders were to capture Stalingrad. He'd advance until he did. Throughout August, 6th Army pushed toward the city. Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies defended, trading space for time, retreating into Stalingrad itself. Paulus expected the city to fall within weeks. German forces had captured dozens of Soviet cities. Stalingrad would be one more. His intelligence officers estimated 30,000 Soviet defenders inside the city. The actual number was closer to 100,000 and growing daily, but Paulus didn't know that. He advanced confidently toward the greatest military disaster in German history. August 23rd. The Luftwaffe launched a massive firebombing raid on Stalingrad. 600 aircraft dropped incendiaries across the city. The wooden buildings in the residential districts ignited immediately. Firestorms created winds that spread flames across entire neighborhoods. 40,000 civilians died in a single day. The city's center became an inferno. Smoke rose thousands of feet, visible from 50 miles away. German commanders assumed this would break Soviet resistance. Instead, it created the battlefield conditions that would doom the attackers. The ruins provided infinite defensive positions. Every pile of rubble was a fortress. Every basement was a bunker. The city that had been reasonably intact now became a landscape perfectly suited for defensive warfare. Soviet response to Case Blue's success was panicked improvisation that somehow worked. Stalin brought back officers he'd previously purged. Some had been in prison camps. They were released, given commands, told to stop the German advance. Marshal Andrei Yeremenko took command of the southeastern front, defending Stalingrad. General Vasily Chuikov took command of 62nd Army inside the city itself. These men were competent, ruthless, and realistic. They understood that holding Stalingrad required accepting catastrophic casualties. They'd fight for every building. They'd counterattack constantly to keep Germans off balance. They'd make Germans pay in blood for every meter. Chuikov moved his headquarters to a bunker on the Volga riverbank, literally backs to the river. Retreat wasn't an option because there was nowhere to retreat to. But the real Soviet response was happening far from the battlefield. At Stavka headquarters in Moscow, Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky were planning a counteroffensive, not at Stalingrad itself, where German attention focused, but against Stalingrad's flanks, held by Romanian and Italian armies. Those satellite armies were poorly equipped, poorly led, and extended across vast frontages. They were weak points. If Soviet forces could break through those weak points and encircle Stalingrad, they could trap the entire German Sixth Army. The operation was given a code name, Uranus. It would require months of secret preparation. Forces would have to be assembled without German intelligence detecting them. Supplies would have to be stockpiled. The Stavka began moving pieces into position. Meanwhile, at Stalingrad itself, Chuikov's men prepared to die buying time. The battle that would decide the war was about to begin, and both sides were committing to courses of action from which there could be no turning back. Stalingrad, September 13th, 1942, dawn. German infantry from the 71st Infantry Division advanced through rubble that yesterday had been apartment buildings. Ahead, through the smoke, rose the shell of the main railway station. It had changed hands twice already. Today would be the third time. German machine gunners took positions in upper floors. Mortars dropped shells on suspected Soviet positions. Engineers crawled forward with flamethrowers. The attack went in. Soviet defenders from 62nd Army's 13th Guards Division waited until Germans entered the building, then opened fire at point-blank range. The railway station became a slaughterhouse. Rooms changed hands 6 times in 2 hours. Bodies piled in hallways. Both sides threw grenades into rooms before entering. Both sides lost men to friendly fire in the chaos. By noon, Germans held most of the station. By evening, a Soviet counterattack retook it. The station would change hands 15 times in 6 hours. When the fighting finally ended, it was unclear who held it, because there was nothing left to hold. Welcome to Stalingrad, where distance was measured in corpses. The battle for Stalingrad became something unprecedented in modern warfare. This wasn't maneuver, this wasn't encirclement, this was direct, savage, close-range combat sustained over months. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Fighting occurred in sewers, basements, ground floors, upper stories, and rooftops simultaneously. A Soviet platoon might hold a building's basement while Germans held the upper floors. Combat ranges were measured in meters. Soldiers heard enemy soldiers breathing in the next room. They threw grenades around corners. They fired through walls. They fought with knives when ammunition ran out. The violence was personal in a way that modern war rarely was. Soldiers saw the faces of men they killed. They smelled the blood. The psychological trauma was indescribable. General Chuikov, commanding the defense from his bunker carved into the Volga riverbank, developed tactics specifically for urban warfare. Stay close to the enemy. The closer Soviet forces were to German forces, the less Germans could use their artillery and air support without hitting their own troops. Chuikov ordered his men to move positions constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. He emphasized night attacks. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to darkness and cold, had advantages at night. He created assault groups, small combined teams of 10 to 12 men, including riflemen, machine gunners, and sappers, all armed with grenades and submachine guns. These groups would infiltrate German-held buildings, fight room to room, and either capture the position or die trying. Survival wasn't expected. Effectiveness was all that mattered. Pavlov's house became the most famous example of Soviet defensive tenacity. It was a 4-story apartment building near the central landing stage on the Volga. In late September, a platoon led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov seized the building and fortified it. They knocked firing holes in walls. They laid mines around the approaches. They brought in anti-tank rifles and machine guns. For 58 days, this single platoon held the building against repeated German assaults. German infantry attacked it. German tanks fired directly at it. Luftwaffe dive bombers hit it repeatedly. The building was reduced to rubble, but the defenders remained, fighting from the basement and from rubble piles. Chuikov later joked that more Germans died trying to capture Pavlov's house than died capturing Paris. The joke wasn't far from truth. The fighting consumed German units designed for mobile warfare, and forced them into static, attritional combat for which they weren't organized. German soldiers discovered that their tactical advantages disappeared in urban ruins. Superior artillery, couldn't see targets in the rubble, air superiority. Pilots couldn't distinguish friend from enemy in destroyed buildings. Better training, negated when combat occurred at 3-meter range. Technological edge. A 34 was as deadly as a Tiger tank in street fighting. German advantages evaporated. Soviet determination manifested. The result was a stalemate measured in daily casualty figures that shocked even Eastern Front veterans. Mamayev-Kurgan, a hill dominating central Stalingrad, became a microcosm of the entire battle's futility. The hill changed hands 8 times in September alone. German forces needed it to observe Soviet positions and direct artillery. Soviet forces needed it to defend the ferry crossings. So they fought for it, day after day, week after week. The hilltop soil became so saturated with metal fragments from shells and bullets that compasses didn't work. Grass wouldn't grow there for years after the war. The earth was black with ash and blood. A German soldier later described standing on the summit surrounded by German graves, looking at Soviet graves, and realizing that thousands of men had died fighting for a hill that gave neither side decisive advantage. They died because neither side could afford to concede it. That was Stalingrad. Men died for positions whose only value was that the enemy wanted them. Soviet logistics were equally desperate. The only supply route into Stalingrad was across the Volga River, directly under German observation and artillery fire. Ferries and barges made nighttime runs, carrying ammunition, food, and reinforcements to the city's defenders. German artillery shelled the crossings relentlessly. Luftwaffe bombers struck by day. Many vessels sank. Cargoes went to the bottom, men drowned, but the ferries kept running because 62nd Army's survival depended on them. A single night's supplies might sustain a division for 2 days. When those supplies ran out, soldiers fought with whatever they had. Soviet troops learned to strip German dead for ammunition, food, and equipment. German weapons became prized because German ammunition was more readily available than Soviet ammunition. Reinforcements arriving in Stalingrad faced an experience that destroyed many before they fired a shot. New divisions would be loaded onto ferries on the Volga's east bank. They'd cross at night while German shells fell around them. Many never reached the west bank. Those who did landed in a hell beyond imagination. The city was rubble. The air stank of corpses. The sound of gunfire was continuous. Officers would direct the survivors to their assembly areas, often just a crater or a destroyed building. Life expectancy for a new arrival was 24 hours. Most Soviet soldiers who fought in Stalingrad were killed or wounded. The divisions that went into the city came out as remnants, but they bought time. Every day they held was a day closer to Soviet counteroffensive. October and November saw German forces make incremental gains. The 6th Army pushed 62nd Army back toward the Volga. Soviet defenders held pockets scattered through the city, the tractor factory in the north, the Red October steel plant in the center, the grain elevator near the river. Each pocket required separate reduction. Each consumed days or weeks. German casualties mounted steadily. A division that entered Stalingrad at full strength would be combat ineffective within a month. Paulus fed in fresh divisions. They too became consumed. By mid-November, parts of the 6th Army had been fighting continuously in Stalingrad for 3 months. They were exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly aware that this battle would never end. They'd captured 90% of the city. The last 10% would cost them everything. November 11th, 1942. German forces launched what was intended to be the final assault to clear Stalingrad completely. They attacked from multiple directions, aiming to split the remaining Soviet-held areas and push the survivors into the Volga. For 4 days, the fighting reached intensities that surpassed even Stalingrad's horrific norms. German soldiers advanced building by building, floor by floor. Soviet defenders counterattacked constantly. Casualties on both sides were catastrophic. By November 15th, German forces had reached the Volga in several places. 62nd Army was split into isolated pockets, backs literally to the river. Paulus reported that the city was nearly captured. German propaganda prepared victory announcements. and in the frozen steppe north and south of Stalingrad, 1 million Soviet soldiers waited in assembly areas. 0 hour for Operation Uranus was 36 hours away. The city was nearly won. The army was about to be lost. Serafimovich Bridgehead, north of Stalingrad, November 19th, 1942, 7:30 a.m. Romanian sentries manning positions along the Don River heard something in the darkness that made their blood freeze. A deep, continuous rumble, growing louder, thunder without lightning. The ground began to vibrate. Then, at 7:30 precisely, the darkness exploded. 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars opened fire simultaneously along a 100-mile front. The barrage was so intense that Romanian soldiers couldn't hear their own screams. Shells fell at the rate of 100 per minute across every square kilometer of the target zone. Bunkers collapsed. Communication trenches caved in. Wire lines were cut. Romanian artillery positions were obliterated before they could fire a single counter-battery round. The bombardment lasted 80 minutes. When it lifted, 1 million Soviet soldiers emerged from morning fog and drove forward. Operation Uranus, the counter-offensive that would change the war, had begun. The Soviet plan was brutally simple: double envelopment. The southwestern front and Don front would attack from bridgeheads north of Stalingrad, smashing through Romanian Third Army. The Stalingrad front would attack from south of the city, breaking through Romanian Fourth Army. The two pincers would meet at Kalach, 40 miles west of Stalingrad, encircling the entire German Sixth Army. Stavka had been planning this operation since September, accumulating forces in absolute secrecy. German intelligence had detected some Soviet buildup but underestimated its scale. More critically, they'd underestimated Soviet capability. The Red Army that attacked on November 19th wasn't the disorganized mass of 1941. This was a professional force that had learned modern warfare through blood and catastrophe. The Romanian Third Army disintegrated within hours. Romanian divisions, equipped with obsolete weapons and spread across impossibly wide frontages, couldn't withstand the onslaught. Soviet 34 tanks crashed through Romanian defensive lines. Infantry followed in columns, bypassing strongpoints, driving deep into the rear. Romanian units that tried to hold were encircled and destroyed. Units that retreated were overrun by Soviet mobile columns. By noon on November 19th, Soviet forces had penetrated 12 miles. By evening, the penetration was 25 miles deep and widening. The northern pincer was ahead of schedule. German commanders at Sixth Army headquarters in Stalingrad received fragmentary reports of disaster to their northwest and couldn't believe their scale. November 20th, 7 a.m. The southern pincer attacked. The Stalingrad front's assault hit Romanian Fourth Army with the same devastating combination of artillery, tanks, and infantry. Romanian defenders, already demoralized by reports from the north, broke even faster. By midday, Soviet tanks were racing west across open steppe. Soviet cavalry divisions, still part of the Red Army's order of battle, exploited gaps in the lines. This wasn't methodical advance. This was pursuit. Soviet commanders, sensing opportunity, pushed their units beyond planned objectives. Tank units that should have halted for refueling kept advancing. Infantry units marched through the night. The two Soviet pincers were converging faster than the operational plan anticipated. At Sixth Army headquarters, General Paulus faced the crisis of his career. Reports flooded in from all directions. Romanian armies on both flanks collapsing, Soviet tank columns driving west, German rear area units being overrun, supply dumps captured, airfields evacuated under fire. Paulus ordered his staff to assess the situation. How large was the Soviet attack? Where were the main thrusts? Could the flanks be stabilized? The answers that came back were fragmentary and terrifying. Soviet forces were everywhere. The scale was enormous. Stabilization might be impossible. Paulus's chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, proposed an immediate breakout toward the southwest while a corridor still existed. Paulus hesitated. Hitler's standing orders were clear. No strategic withdrawals without explicit permission. Abandoning Stalingrad would require authorization from the Führer himself. November 21st. Soviet tankers from 26th Tank Corps, driving west from the northern penetration, spotted dust clouds to the south. they trained binoculars and saw Soviet tanks approaching from the opposite direction. At 2 p.m., near the town of Sovietsky, 30 miles west of Stalingrad, forward elements of Southwestern Front's mobile units met forward elements of Stalingrad Front's mobile units. Soldiers dismounted, embraced, celebrated. They'd closed the trap. Behind them, to the east, the entire German Sixth Army was encircled. 290,000 German and Romanian soldiers were trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. It was the largest encirclement since Kiev. Except this time, Germans were inside the pocket. The full magnitude took days to comprehend. Sixth Army was Germany's largest and most powerful field army. It contained 20 divisions, including panzer and motorized divisions. It possessed over 200 tanks, 1,800 artillery pieces, and 10,000 vehicles. These weren't rear echelon troops. These were veteran formations that had fought from Poland to Stalingrad. Now they were surrounded, deep in Soviet territory, with winter approaching. The logistical requirements were staggering. Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies daily: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts. The only way to provide those supplies was by air. And everyone with operational experience knew that the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain an airlift of that magnitude. Everyone, that is, except Hermann Göring. The Reichsmarschall, commanding the Luftwaffe, made a promise that would doom 290,000 men. On November 22nd, Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped Sixth Army by air. He claimed that German transport aircraft could deliver 500 tons daily, adequate for survival if not comfort. Hitler seized on this assurance. It solved his dilemma. Sixth Army wouldn't have to retreat. It would be supplied by air until German forces broke through from outside. Paulus received his orders on November 24th. Sixth Army would form a hedgehog defense and hold Stalingrad. Relief was coming. An airlift would sustain them. The fortress concept that had worked at Demyansk earlier in 1942 would work again at Stalingrad. The airlift failed from the first day. Luftwaffe planners had warned Göring that 500 tons daily was impossible. The Luftwaffe possessed only about 500 transport aircraft in total, and many were committed to other operations. The aircraft that could be assembled for Stalingrad numbered around 300 Ju-52 transports, each carrying 2.5 tons. Even flying multiple sorties daily in perfect conditions, they couldn't deliver 500 tons, and conditions were far from perfect. Soviet fighters swarmed the air corridors. Soviet anti-aircraft guns ringed Stalingrad's airfields. Winter weather grounded aircraft for days. Luftwaffe crews flew in conditions that should have prohibited flight and died in crashes or shot down by fighters. The reality of air supply was brutal. On November 25th, the airlift's first day, 35 aircraft reached Stalingrad, delivering 75 tons. On November 26th, 48 aircraft delivered 95 tons. These weren't exceptional days, they were typical. Throughout December, the airlift averaged 95 tons daily. On the best day, December 19th, the Luftwaffe delivered 289 tons. On the worst days, nothing arrived. Aircraft were shot down, pilots became casualties. The transport fleet shrank. Every loss was irreplaceable. Germany was running out of transport aircraft. And inside the pocket, 300,000 men were slowly starving. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, Sixth Army's situation deteriorated daily. Food rations were cut to starvation levels. Soldiers received 300 calories per day, less than a quarter of what active men required. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When horses ran out, men ate whatever they could find. Fuel was rationed so strictly that most vehicles sat immobile. Ammunition expenditure was controlled. Artillery units received orders to fire only at confirmed targets. Infantry defended with rifles and machine guns, conserving ammunition for desperate situations. Medical supplies ran out. Thousands of wounded lay in basements and bunkers without anesthesia or proper care. Disease spread. Dysentery, typhus, and frostbite decimated units as effectively as combat. The encircled soldiers' morale followed a predictable trajectory. Initially, confidence prevailed. They'd been promised relief. The airlift would sustain them. They just had to hold. By late November, confidence wavered. The airlift wasn't delivering promised amounts. Where was the relief force? By early December, despair began spreading. Letters home, initially censored but later recovered, revealed growing hopelessness. Soldiers wrote about friends dying from hunger, about watching the sky for aircraft that didn't come, about wondering if anyone remembered they existed. Paulus, maintaining discipline through force of will and German military culture, kept the army functioning. But everyone understood the situation was untenable. The question wasn't whether Sixth Army would be destroyed. The question was whether anyone would survive. Outside the pocket, Soviet forces strengthened the encirclement ring. Fresh divisions arrived to create multiple defensive belts. If Germans tried to break out, they'd face layer after layer of defenses. Soviet artillery zeroed in on every approach. Tank armies positioned to counterattack any relief attempt. The trap was closing tighter. And in Berlin, in the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler insisted that Sixth Army hold. Stalingrad bore his name. Its loss would be propaganda disaster. Therefore, it would not be lost. Therefore, Sixth Army would hold. The trapped soldiers, reading these pronouncements in Wehrmacht communiques, understood they'd been sacrificed for prestige. They would die so Hitler could avoid admitting defeat. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, surrounded by enemies, starving and freezing, 290,000 German soldiers entered what would be the longest 3 months of their lives. Most wouldn't survive them. Kotelnikovo Airfield, southwest of Stalingrad, December 12, 1942, 5 a.m. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stood in the operations room of Army Group Don headquarters, studying maps that showed his relief force assembling for Operation Winter Storm. Manstein was Germany's most brilliant operational commander, the architect of the invasion of France, the conqueror of Sevastopol. If anyone could rescue Sixth Army, it was him. He'd assembled 4th Panzer Army, 6 divisions, including 3 panzer divisions with 230 tanks. They would attack northeast from Kotelnikovo towards Stalingrad, breaking through Soviet encirclement forces. Once they reached the pocket, Sixth Army would break out to meet them. The two forces would link up, and the catastrophe would be averted. It was the best plan possible given available resources. It required everything to go right. In war, everything rarely goes right. The attack began at 5:15 a.m., with an artillery barrage followed by an armored thrust. 4th Panzer Army's spearhead, led by the 6th Panzer Division and 23rd Panzer Division, crashed into Soviet positions. Soviet defenders from the 51st Army fought hard but gave ground. By December 13th, German tanks had advanced 10 miles. By December 14th, 20 miles. The advance was slower than planned. Soviet resistance was fierce, but it was advancing. In Stalingrad, Paulus received news of the relief attempt and prepared Sixth Army for breakout operations. Then he received new orders from Hitler. Sixth Army would not break out. It would hold Stalingrad. 4th Panzer Army would break through to Stalingrad and establish a supply corridor. Paulus was appalled. His army was dying. Breakout was the only chance. Hitler's orders made relief exponentially harder and survival less likely. Manstein faced an impossible dilemma. His orders were to relieve Stalingrad, not evacuate it. But relief without breakout was meaningless. Even if 4th Panzer Army reached the pocket, it couldn't supply 6th Army indefinitely. The only rational course was for Paulus to begin breakout immediately, while 4th Panzer Army was still advancing. But Paulus wouldn't disobey Hitler's explicit orders. Manstein sent his chief of staff to 6th Army headquarters to argue in person. General Hans Valentin Hube, commanding 14th Panzer Corps inside the pocket, added his voice. Break out now while the opportunity exists. Paulus refused. He needed written orders from Hitler, and Hitler wouldn't issue those orders. December 19th. 4th Panzer Army reached the Mishkova River, 30 miles from Stalingrad's perimeter. This was the closest they'd come. Forward reconnaissance units could hear the sound of artillery from the pocket. Soviet resistance had stiffened dramatically. Soviet Second Guards Army, a fresh formation, had been thrown into blocking positions. German advance slowed to a few hundred meters per day. Casualties mounted. The panzer divisions, which had begun with 230 tanks, were down to 60 operational vehicles. Fuel was running short. Ammunition was being rationed. Still, They were 30 miles away. A desperate breakout by 6th Army, coordinated with a final push by 4th Panzer Army, might just succeed. Inside Stalingrad, 6th Army's condition made breakout nearly impossible even if ordered. Soldiers were starving. Thousands were sick. Most vehicles had been cannibalized for parts or burned for fuel. The army possessed enough fuel to move perhaps 30 miles, assuming no combat. But breakout meant fighting through Soviet encirclement forces while moving. It meant abandoning wounded, equipment, and supplies. It meant marching through winter storms toward a relief force that was itself barely surviving. Paulus calculated that perhaps half his army might reach German lines if breakout succeeded. The other half would die or be captured. He wanted Hitler's personal authorization before accepting those casualties. Hitler wouldn't give it. December 24th. Soviet forces launched a massive counterattack against 4th Panzer Army's positions at the Mishkova River. Fresh Soviet tank armies, held in reserve specifically for this moment, struck 4th Panzer Army's flanks. The Italian 8th Army, defending 4th Panzer Army's left flank, collapsed. Soviet tank columns poured through the gap. Manstein faced a choice: continue pushing towards Stalingrad and risk 4th Panzer Army's encirclement, or retreat and save his force. He chose survival. On December 24, 4th Panzer Army began withdrawing from the Mishkova River. The relief attempt had failed. 6th Army was on its own. The Luftwaffe airlift, 6th Army's lifeline, was collapsing simultaneously. The original airfields inside the pocket, Pitomnik and Gumrak, came under Soviet artillery fire. Aircraft landing or taking off were shelled. Wounded soldiers waited on runways as Soviet shells fell around them. Luftwaffe crews showed extraordinary courage, landing under fire, loading wounded, taking off through artillery barrages. But courage couldn't overcome mathematics. The airlift needed to deliver 700 tons daily. It was delivering less than 100. The gap between requirement and delivery meant soldiers died daily from starvation. Units maintained operational lists showing how many men remained alive, not how many remained combat effective. Alive became the relevant metric. Christmas 1942, inside the Stalingrad pocket, was a frozen nightmare. German soldiers, raised in a Christian culture, marked the holiday in bunkers and ruined buildings. Some sang carols. Some prayed. Some simply endured. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Food rations that day were 100 grams of bread and a bowl of watery soup. No Christmas dinner, no decorations. No leave, just survival. Officers tried to maintain morale by reading messages from Hitler promising that relief was coming, that 6th Army's sacrifice was appreciated, that they were heroes of the Reich. Soldiers listened and knew they'd been abandoned. Christmas packages from home arrived by air, pathetically few. Most soldiers received nothing. They spent Christmas watching friends die and wondering if they'd see another Christmas. Most wouldn't. The psychological collapse was inevitable. Soldiers who'd maintained discipline through autumn now began breaking. Desertion became common, not to Soviet lines but into the ruins where men hid rather than face another day of combat and starvation. Suicides increased. Officers shot themselves rather than watch their men starve. Discipline was maintained through courts-martial and executions. Soldiers caught stealing food were shot. Soldiers abandoning positions were shot. The violence turned inward as well as outward. German soldiers, products of a military culture emphasizing honor and duty, now existed in conditions that made honor meaningless and duty a death sentence. Soviet forces tightened the noose methodically. They didn't need to attack aggressively. Time was their ally. Every day the pocket shrank. Soviet artillery pounded German positions. Soviet snipers picked off anyone who moved carelessly. Soviet propaganda loudspeakers broadcast messages in German. Every 7 seconds, a German dies in Russia. Stalingrad, mass grave. The psychological warfare was effective because it was true. Inside the pocket, a German soldier died every 7 seconds. From artillery, from starvation, from disease, from cold. The casualty figures were staggering even by Eastern Front standards. Manstein made one last attempt to save something from disaster. In late December, he flew to Hitler's headquarters to argue personally for authorizing 6th Army's breakout. The conversation was surreal. Manstein presented operational assessments showing Sixth Army's imminent destruction. Hitler responded with ideology. Germany didn't retreat. Stalingrad bore his name. Its loss was unacceptable. Manstein argued that Sixth Army's loss would be far worse than Stalingrad's loss. Hitler was unmoved. He'd made promises to the German people. Those promises couldn't be broken. Manstein left the meeting understanding that Sixth Army would be sacrificed for Hitler's prestige. He returned to his headquarters and prepared for the inevitable. Sixth Army was doomed. The only question was how many other units would be dragged down with it. New Year's Eve, 1942. Inside Stalingrad, soldiers marked the new year with bitter resignation. 1942 had begun with confidence. Germany would win the war that year. Now 1943 arrived with 290,000 Germans trapped, starving, and dying. The Soviet ring was complete. No relief was coming. The Luftwaffe couldn't supply them. Breakout was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. So they waited. They held positions. They followed orders. They maintained German military discipline even as German military strategy had condemned them. In bunkers across the pocket, soldiers wrote final letters, knowing they'd never be delivered. They described the hunger, the cold, the futility. They asked forgiveness from families they'd never see again. They wondered what they'd died for. On the frozen steppes of southern Russia, in the ruins of a city that bore Stalin's name, the German army faced the consequences of hubris. The relief had failed. The pocket was sealed. The final act was about to begin. Stalingrad Pocket, January 10th, 1943, 8 a.m. Soviet artillery opened the final offensive with a barrage that made previous bombardments seem trivial. 7,000 guns and mortars, positioned in concentric rings around the shrinking pocket, fired simultaneously. The bombardment lasted 2 hours. Inside German positions, soldiers who'd survived 4 months of siege pressed themselves into frozen earth and prayed. When the shells stopped, Soviet infantry advanced through the morning fog. This wasn't reconnaissance. This wasn't probing. This was Operation Ring, the deliberate liquidation of Sixth Army. The Red Army was coming to finish what it had started. No more stalemate. No more waiting. Final destruction. The Soviet plan divided the pocket into sections, then destroyed each section systematically. The 65th Army attacked from the west. The 21st Army struck from the north. The 62nd Army, Chuikov's command that had defended Stalingrad itself, now attacked from the east. The 64th Army came from the south. 6th Army, surrounded on all sides, would be compressed into an ever smaller area until it ceased to exist. Resistance would be overcome through overwhelming firepower. Any unit that held would be bypassed and encircled. The operation was methodical, industrial, inevitable. Soviet commanders gave their troops explicit orders: minimize casualties, maximize firepower, accept no surrender until organized resistance ended. German defenses disintegrated rapidly. Units at 50% strength before Operation Ring began now shattered completely. Divisions that should have held sectors held single villages. Regiments defending positions were battalion-sized. Battalions were company-sized. Companies were platoons. Platoons were squads. The entire organizational structure was collapsing. Officers commanded remnants. Non-commissioned officers led groups of soldiers who'd lost their units. Individual soldiers wandered through the pocket, looking for any German formation. The army was dying organizationally before it died physically. January 16th. Soviet forces captured Potomnik Airfield, the pocket's main air supply base. This was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe had been landing at Potomnik, however inadequately, delivering some supplies and evacuating some wounded. With Potomnik lost, only Gumrak Airfield remained. But Gumrak was under direct Soviet artillery fire. Aircraft attempting to land were hit on approach. The air supply that had been inadequate now became virtually non-existent. Inside the pocket, 25,000 wounded lay in makeshift hospitals without anesthesia, bandages, or hope. Medical officers performed amputations with bayonets. Soldiers died from gangrene because there was no medicine. The lucky ones died quickly from their wounds. The unlucky lingered for days, knowing no evacuation was possible. January 26th. Soviet spearheads driving from opposite directions met inside the pocket, splitting it in two. The southern group, trapped in Stalingrad's ruins, became isolated from the northern group, holding ground west of the city. Communication between the two groups ceased. Each was now fighting its own separate battle. Paulus commanded the southern group from his headquarters in the basement of a department store in Stalingrad's center. He sent radio messages to the northern group, but received no replies. Either the radios had died or the commanders were dead. The Sixth Army had fractured. What remained weren't armies or corps, but isolated groups waiting to die. The conditions defied description. Soldiers hadn't bathed in months. Lice infested everyone. Dysentery was universal. Typhus spread through crowded bunkers. Dead bodies lay where they fell because survivors lacked strength to bury them. Temperatures remained below -20 Celsius. Soldiers burned furniture, books, anything combustible for warmth. Ammunition was exhausted. Artillery pieces stood silent. Machine guns had no bullets. Rifles were useless without cartridges. German soldiers faced Soviet attacks armed with shovels and bayonets. Some fought, some surrendered. Some simply stood and waited to die because all options led to death anyway. January 31st, 1943. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. The promotion was announced by radio. The message was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to commit suicide or die fighting. Hitler's gesture was meant to provide Paulus with a way out that preserved honor. Instead, it highlighted the obscenity of the situation. Hitler, safe in East Prussia, was lecturing starving men on honor, while denying them permission to escape months earlier when escape was possible. Paulus received the promotion in his basement headquarters, surrounded by dying soldiers, and understood its meaning. He refused the implied command. That evening, Soviet troops reached the department store. Paulus's staff destroyed documents and equipment. At 6 a.m. on February 1st, Paulus surrendered. The surrender was piecemeal. Paulus's capture didn't end resistance everywhere. The northern pocket fought for another 36 hours. Individual units, cut off and without orders, continued fighting because they didn't know surrender was an option or because they feared Soviet captivity more than death. Soviet soldiers clearing bunkers found German wounded who'd frozen to death rather than surrender. They found German officers who'd shot themselves rather than be captured. The final gunfire in Stalingrad died out on February 2nd, 1943. 4 months after being encircled, Sixth Army ceased to exist. The toll was horrific beyond comprehension. Of 290,000 Axis soldiers trapped in the pocket, 91,000 surrendered. The rest were dead. The ground was so frozen that bodies remained where they fell, to be uncovered months later when the ground thawed. The Soviets marched their prisoners west to internment camps. The march was a death march. Prisoners, already starving and sick, walked through winter cold with no food or shelter. They died by thousands on the roadside. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity from starvation, disease, or exposure. Stalingrad consumed the Sixth Army utterly. In Germany, the news was initially suppressed, then released as a heroic tragedy. Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Radio broadcasts announced that Sixth Army had fought to the last man, sacrificing themselves in heroic resistance. The truth, that they'd been trapped by strategic stupidity and abandoned by ideological obstinacy, was hidden. German families received notices that their sons, husbands, and fathers had fallen at Stalingrad. The notices didn't mention surrender. They didn't mention starvation. They presented death in combat as honorable sacrifice. Many families believed this narrative. Others understood that their loved ones had died for nothing. The strategic impact was immediate and enormous. Sixth Army had been Germany's largest field army. Its destruction created a hole in German lines that couldn't be filled. 20 divisions ceased to exist. The equipment losses were irreplaceable. 500 aircraft, 1,500 tanks, 6,000 artillery pieces, tens of thousands of vehicles. The personnel losses were even worse. Not just the 91,000 prisoners, but the 199,000 dead. Germany couldn't replace these losses. The Wehrmacht would never again possess the strength it had in summer 1942. Every subsequent operation would be conducted with awareness of insufficient forces. Germany was losing the war of attrition. The psychological impact exceeded the strategic impact. The myth of German invincibility, damaged at Moscow, shattered at Stalingrad. German soldiers now knew they could be defeated, encircled, destroyed. They knew that Hitler's orders could doom them. They knew that promises of relief might be lies. Trust between the front lines and high command eroded. German civilians understood that the war news was propaganda. If Sixth Army could be lost, what else might be lost? Allied governments, watching Stalingrad, understood that Germany could be beaten. The Soviet Union had survived the worst Germany could inflict and had struck back decisively. The tide had turned. Stalingrad was the hinge on which the war pivoted. After Stalingrad, Germany would retreat. The only question was how long retreat would take, how many more would die, and where it would end. In the ruins of Stalingrad, among frozen corpses and starving prisoners, those answers were already visible. Germany would retreat all the way to Berlin. Millions more would die. And it would end in Hitler's bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The path from Stalingrad to Berlin was direct. It would take 2 more years to traverse, but the direction was set. Germany was finished. Kharkov, Ukraine, February 15, 1943. Soviet tanks from the 6th Guards Army rolled into the city's outskirts, recapturing Ukraine's second-largest city for the second time. Citizens emerged from cellars waving flags. Red Army soldiers were embraced as liberators. The same streets where Germans had triumphantly marched in October 1941 now witnessed German retreat. Across southern Russia and Ukraine, the entire German southern front was collapsing. Stalingrad's destruction had opened a cascade of Soviet offensives. Soviet commanders, emboldened by their greatest victory, launched attacks everywhere. Army Group A, still deep in the Caucasus, began racing north to avoid encirclement. Army Group Don, Manstein's command, retreated westward, fighting desperate rearguard actions. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat for the first time since 1918. The long journey back to Germany had begun. The Soviet winter offensive of 1942-43 was the strategic mirror of German successes in 1941. Everywhere, Soviet forces attacked. The Bryansk front drove toward Orel. The Voronezh front attacked toward Kursk. The southwestern front pushed toward the Dnieper. Stalin, watching victories accumulate, demanded more. Take Kharkov. Recapture the Donbass. Drive to the Dnieper River. Liberate Ukraine before spring. His commanders warned of overextension. Logistics couldn't support advances of this speed. Units were exhausted. Supply lines stretched impossibly far. Stalin dismissed these concerns. The Germans were beaten. Pressed the advantage. So Soviet armies advanced, outrunning their supplies, dispersing across vast frontages, creating the conditions for German counterattack. Army Group A's retreat from the Caucasus was the longest withdrawal in German military history. 1st Panzer Army and 17th Army, which had advanced 600 miles south toward Baku, now had to retrace that distance fighting continuously. Soviet forces harassed them at every step. Partisans destroyed bridges. The weather alternated between freezing cold and spring thaws that turned roads to mud. German units, already weakened by months in the Caucasus, suffered continuous casualties. But they escaped. By mid-February, they'd reached Rostov and crossed the Don River. The retreat succeeded because Soviet forces, focused on pursuing Army Group Don toward Kharkov, didn't commit enough strength to trap Army Group A. The Germans escaped, but they'd abandoned the Caucasus oil fields they'd fought all summer to reach. All the sacrifices, all the casualties, had gained nothing. Manstein, commanding what remained of German forces in southern Russia, recognized that the Soviet offensive had created an opportunity. Soviet mobile units had advanced hundreds of miles beyond their infantry. They were dispersed. Their supply lines were overextended. If German forces could concentrate unexpectedly and strike a single Soviet spearhead, they could inflict local defeats. Manstein proposed a backhand blow. Let Soviet forces advance further, stretching themselves thin, then counterattack with concentrated panzer forces. Hitler, traumatized by Stalingrad, initially resisted. Voluntary retreat looked like defeatism. Manstein argued it was operational art. Reluctantly, Hitler agreed. German forces would trade space for the opportunity to strike. February 20th. German forces evacuated Kharkov. the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union. Soviet forces entered the city in triumph. Stalin proclaimed that Ukraine's liberation had begun. Soviet commanders planned further advances toward the Dnieper River. They didn't realize they'd walked into Manstein's trap. 3 German Panzer Corps, secretly concentrated south of Kharkov, struck northward into the flank of the advancing Soviet columns. The German attack was sudden, coordinated, and devastating. Soviet mobile units, caught unprepared, reeled backward. German tanks recaptured ground that had been lost weeks earlier. The Soviet advance became a retreat. March 15th, German forces recaptured Kharkov. The backhand blow had succeeded brilliantly. Soviet forces, overextended and disorganized, were pushed back 100 miles. The southwestern corner of the front stabilized. Manstein had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, while no longer capable of strategic offensives, could still conduct successful operational counterattacks. The victory restored some confidence. German officers who'd witnessed Stalingrad's disaster saw that skilled leadership could still achieve local successes. But everyone understood these were tactical victories within strategic defeat. Germany had lost initiative. These counterattacks didn't change the war's direction. They merely slowed the inevitable. The spring Rasputitsa ended major operations in March and April. Both sides used the mud season to regroup and assess. German losses since November were catastrophic. Over 800,000 casualties, including the entire Sixth Army. Soviet losses were higher, over 2 million, but the Soviets were replacing them. German replacements barely covered routine attrition. The Wehrmacht was shrinking. Every major operation consumed forces that couldn't be regenerated. Soviet forces were growing. New armies formed continuously. Soviet industrial production, relocated beyond the Urals, now exceeded German production in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. German strategic planning for summer 1943 focused on a single salient in the front lines, Kursk. Soviet winter offensives had created a massive bulge in the lines around Kursk, projecting west into German-held territory. From a map, it looked like an opportunity. German forces could attack the salient from north and south, cutting off the Soviet forces inside. If successful, such an operation would destroy multiple Soviet armies and straighten the front line. Planning began immediately. The operation would be called Citadel. It would be Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. Every available Panzer division would participate. New weapons, Tiger and Panther tanks, would give Germans a technological edge. Citadel would demonstrate that Germany could still win operationally, even if not strategically. The planning was meticulous. The preparations were obvious, and Soviet intelligence was watching everything. The Soviets knew about Citadel months before it launched. Soviet spy networks in Switzerland passed German plans to Moscow. Soviet reconnaissance detected German troop movements. Most importantly, the Kursk salient was so obvious and objective that even without intelligence, Soviet commanders would have anticipated attack. Zhukov and Vasilevsky developed a brilliant defensive strategy. Let the Germans attack, absorb their offensive with prepared defenses, bleed the panzer divisions white. Then counterattack when German forces were exhausted. The Soviets began constructing the most elaborate defensive system in military history. Multiple defensive belts, thousands of anti-tank guns, minefields laid in unprecedented density. The Kursk salient became a fortress. When Germans attacked, they'd walk into a meat grinder. But Kursk was months away. Through spring 1943, the front lines stabilized roughly from Leningrad in the north, through Smolensk and Kursk, down to the Donbass in the south. Germany held a continuous line, but it was over 1,500 miles long, defended by forces that had been bled white. The Wehrmacht now fought defensively, conserving strength, trying to prevent Soviet breakthroughs. The glory days of rapid advance were finished. Now came the hard mathematics of defensive warfare. How long could increasingly thin German lines hold against increasingly strong Soviet attacks? The Eastern Front had become a war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. Soviet war production revealed the fundamental imbalance. In 1943, Soviet factories would produce 24,000 tanks. German factories would produce 12,000. Soviet aircraft production, 35,000. German, 25,000. Soviet artillery, over 100,000 pieces. German, 40,000. The numbers were devastating. Every destroyed Soviet division could be replaced. Every destroyed German division was irreplaceable. The Soviet Union, having absorbed catastrophic losses in 1941 and 42, was now stronger than when the war began. Germany, victorious in the war's first year, was now weaker. The trajectory was clear. Germany would lose through attrition. The only question was timeline. By May 1943, the situation on the Eastern Front had completely reversed from June 1941. 23 months earlier, Germany attacked with confidence and overwhelming strength. Now, Germany defended with desperation and declining power. The strategic initiative belonged entirely to the Soviet Union. Soviet commanders chose where and when to attack. German commanders reacted. The psychological shift was as important as the material shift. German soldiers understood they were fighting a losing war. Soviet soldiers understood they were winning. Morale, that intangible factor that affects combat effectiveness, now favored the Soviets decisively. Operation Barbarossa, which was supposed to destroy the Soviet Union in 10 weeks, had instead destroyed the Wehrmacht in 23 months. The operation's assumptions, all of them, had proved false. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. The Red Army hadn't been destroyed west of the Dnieper. Moscow hadn't been captured. Soviet industrial capacity hadn't been eliminated. Soviet will to resist hadn't broken. Every assumption that underlay Barbarossa was wrong. And the price of those errors was paid in German blood across 1,000 miles of Russian territory. Stalingrad was the dramatic culmination, but the defeat was comprehensive. From Leningrad to the Caucasus, German forces were retreating or barely holding. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility was shattered. The road ahead led only westward, back toward Germany, toward the final reckoning in Berlin. The aftermath of Barbarossa was 2 more years of grinding retreat, millions more dead, and the destruction of Hitler's Reich. That process was now inevitable. Stalingrad had made it so. Mamayev Kurgan, Stalingrad, present day. A grandmother and her granddaughter climbed the steps toward the enormous memorial statue called The Motherland Calls. The grandmother is 86. She was born in Stalingrad in 1937, was 5 years old during the battle. She remembers the bombing, the fires, being evacuated across the Volga with her mother while her father stayed to fight. He never returned. The granddaughter is 16, learning World War II history in school, struggling to comprehend numbers that seem abstract. 27 million Soviet dead. 80% of Soviet males born in 1923 didn't survive the war. The grandmother doesn't speak in statistics. She points to the memorial wall inscribed with names. Your great-grandfather's name is there, she says, and hundreds of thousands more. The girl reads names, rows and columns of names, walls covered in names, and begins to understand that history isn't abstract. It's individual deaths multiplied into incomprehensibility. Operation Barbarossa changed everything. It created a war so destructive that it redefined human capacity for organized violence. And it began with confident predictions of quick victory. The casualty figures from the Eastern Front exceed human ability to comprehend them emotionally. Total military deaths, over 5 million Axis soldiers, over 10 million Soviet soldiers. Civilian deaths, approximately 15 to 20 million Soviet civilians from combat, starvation, disease, and German occupation policies. The total, military and civilian, exceeds 30 million people. To contextualize, that's equivalent to the entire population of California dying in 4 years. Every Soviet family lost someone. Many families lost everyone. Entire villages were depopulated. The demographic impact persisted for generations. The Soviet Union's population pyramid, distorted by World War II deaths, remained visible in census data into the 21st century. The war killed selectively. Young men, disproportionately. The gender imbalance lasted decades. Soviet women who came of age during the war often never married because there were no men. The war's human cost transcended statistics. It was lived tragedy multiplied millions of times. The military lessons were comprehensive and contradictory. German planners concluded that logistics determined strategy more than tactics. The Wehrmacht's operational brilliance couldn't overcome inadequate supply systems across Russian distances. Future war planners studied Barbarossa as a cautionary tale. Brilliant operations don't guarantee strategic success. Soviet planners learned different lessons. Space and time could be traded for survival. Industrial base preservation mattered more than territorial defense. Ideological motivation, ruthlessly applied, could sustain resistance through catastrophe. Both sides learned that modern industrial warfare consumed resources at rates that made pre-war planning obsolete. The Eastern Front devoured armies, vehicles, aircraft, and materiel faster than they could be produced. Attrition became the dominant factor. The technological evolution was dramatic. In 1941, German tanks were generally superior. By 1943, Soviet tanks equaled or exceeded German armor in all practical measures. The 34, initially a shock to German forces, became the most produced tank of the war, over 60,000 manufactured. Soviet artillery development paralleled tank development. The Katyusha rocket launcher, nicknamed Stalin's organ by Germans, provided devastating area saturation. Soviet aviation, backward in 1941, produced excellent designs by 1943. The Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft became the most produced military aircraft in history. Over 36,000 built. The Eastern Front was an arms race conducted at war speed. Innovations appeared within months of recognition of need. The pressure of existential conflict drove development faster than peacetime ever could. The occupation's brutality revealed Barbarossa's true nature. This wasn't conventional warfare. This was ideological extermination. German occupation policies in the East were explicitly genocidal. The Hunger Plan called for deliberate starvation of tens of millions of Soviet civilians to free resources for Germany. Commissar Order mandated execution of Soviet political officers. The Wehrmacht wasn't merely complicit in atrocities, it was an active participant. Einsatzgruppen death squads followed advancing German forces, murdering Jews, communists, and intelligentsia. Over 1 million Jews were murdered in 1941 alone, most by shooting, before the industrial killing centers became operational. Wehrmacht cooperation with these crimes is extensively documented. Officers who protested were reassigned. Officers who participated were promoted. The Eastern Front was where Nazi ideology manifested as policy. The consequences were crimes on scales that required new vocabulary. Genocide. Leningrad's siege encapsulated the war's horror. 900 days, 1,200,000 dead, mostly from starvation. The siege could have been taken by assault if Germany committed forces. Instead, Hitler ordered starvation. The city would be erased. Its population would die. This was racial war, extermination masked as military operation. Wehrmacht officers implementing the blockade knew they were murdering civilians. They followed orders anyway. Leningrad survived through suffering beyond description, became a symbol of Soviet resistance, proof that Stalin's regime, however brutal, was preferable to Nazi occupation. The siege's propaganda value exceeded its military significance. Soviet citizens understood that German victory meant their deaths. Better to resist, even at terrible cost, than to surrender. The partisan warfare behind German lines was both militarily significant and morally complex. Soviet partisans, operating in forests and marshes, attacked German supply lines, ambushed convoys, destroyed rail lines. Their impact forced Germany to divert hundreds of thousands of troops to rear area security. But German anti-partisan operations were exterminatory. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned, inhabitants murdered. The Wehrmacht conducted anti-partisan sweeps that were massacres. Partisan warfare created a cycle of violence that blurred combatant and civilian distinctions. Both sides committed atrocities. The Germans were systematic policy. Soviet actions were often reprisals. Neither side emerged morally unblemished. But the existence of partisan resistance proved that Soviet populations preferred resistance to occupation. The Soviet victory's enabling factor was industrial evacuation. In summer and autumn 1941, while the Red Army was being destroyed, Soviet authorities evacuated over 1,500 factories eastward. Entire plants were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and moved to the Urals, Siberia, Central Asia. Workers followed their factories. Production resumed, often in open-air conditions before buildings were constructed. This was Stalin's secret weapon. Germany could overrun territory, but couldn't capture industry. By 1942, evacuated factories produced tanks, aircraft, and weapons beyond German reach. Barbarossa's failure to destroy Soviet industrial capacity early was strategic error from which Germany never recovered. Soviet production beyond the Urals sustained the Red Army through its darkest moments and provided material superiority that decided the war. The political consequences extended far beyond military defeat. Barbarossa's failure made D-Day necessary and possible. Germany, forced to maintain massive forces in the east, couldn't adequately defend France. Allied landings in Normandy succeeded partly because Germany's best divisions were dying in Russia. The Eastern Front consumed 80% of Wehrmacht combat power throughout the war. Western Allied campaigns, important as they were, remained secondary theaters. The Soviet Union defeated Germany. Britain and America helped. This recognition shapes post-war understanding. Soviet victory came at unimaginable cost, but it was victory. Stalin emerged from the war controlling Eastern Europe, creating satellite states, imposing communism on half a continent. The Cold War's origins lie in Red Army positions. In May 1945, those positions were determined by Barbarossa's failure and Soviet success in pushing Germans back to Berlin. The counterfactual questions remain debated. Could Germany have won? Most historians conclude no. Even optimal German strategy faced insurmountable obstacles. Insufficient forces for Russia's vast space, inadequate logistics for sustained operations beyond 600 kilometers, impossible timeline constraints given weather and distance, and Soviet willingness to accept casualties that would have broken any Western nation. German tactical and operational excellence couldn't overcome strategic impossibility, but the margins mattered. Better German strategy might have extended the war, captured Moscow, negotiated peace. Stalin might have lost control. Soviet collapse wasn't impossible, just increasingly unlikely as months passed. Every month Soviet resistance continued was a month Soviet industry produced more. Soviet commanders learned more. Soviet people hardened more. Time favored defense. Germany needed quick victory. Quick victory proved impossible. Therefore, Germany lost. The memory remains contested. In Russia, Victory Day is sacred, celebrating triumph over fascism at terrible cost. The narrative emphasizes patriotic resistance, Stalin's leadership, Soviet superiority. Uncomfortable truths, Stalin's pre-war purges, enabling German success. Initial catastrophic defeats, massive casualties from poor decisions, are downplayed. In the West, the Eastern Front remains less understood than Western theaters, despite being more significant. Popular consciousness focuses on D-Day and the Pacific, theaters more relevant to American and British experience. The Eastern Front's scale, brutality, and decisiveness challenge comfortable narratives. It reveals war's true face: industrial slaughter, ideological hatred, limitless violence. Studying Barbarossa requires confronting human capacity for both endurance and atrocity. The lessons for modern militaries remain relevant. Logistics constrains operations more than planning acknowledges. Tactical brilliance doesn't guarantee strategic success. Occupying hostile territory requires impossible force ratios. Ideological wars become exterminatory. Civilian populations will matters decisively. Modern war consumes resources faster than anticipated. These lessons, learned in Russian blood, should inform military thought. Too often, they're forgotten. Planners study Barbarossa's opening phase, admiring German operational art. They should study Barbarossa's conclusion, understanding how operational excellence without strategic foundation leads to catastrophe. The lesson isn't that Germany lost battles. It's that Germany chose an unwinnable war and pursued it with tactical brilliance that only magnified eventual disaster. 83 years after Barbarossa began, the graveyards remain. Across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the former battlefields are marked by memorials. Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad. The Brest Fortress. The Piskarovskoye Memorial Cemetery in St. Petersburg, holding 500,000 Leningrad siege victims. These sites preserve memory of what industrial war costs when prosecuted without limits. They remind visitors that the numbers, those impossible statistics of millions dead, represent individual lives ended violently. They serve as warnings that wars begun confidently can spiral into catastrophes that consume nations. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be Germany's greatest triumph, the conquest that would make the Reich unassailable. Instead, it became Germany's greatest catastrophe, the decision that guaranteed Reich's destruction. The distance from triumph to catastrophe was shorter than Hitler imagined. The operation planned for 10 weeks lasted 4 years and ended in Berlin's ruins. That trajectory, from confidence through catastrophe to utter defeat, is Barbarossa's legacy. It changed everything, and it should never be forgotten.